Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first thing you learn as a licensed trail guide is that mountains don't keep secrets. They simply don't care enough to hide them. The second thing, the one they don't teach in certification courses, is that some silences are louder than screams. I should have recognized it the moment we crossed into the Teton backcountry that October afternoon. Should have felt it in the way my fiance's breathing changed, how her steps became uncertain despite the clear trail ahead. But 8 years guiding these mountains had made me complacent, had convinced me that I understood the language of wilderness, the way some people understand Latin: dead, mapped, conquered. We'd chosen late season deliberately. She wanted solitude for her first real traverse, wanted to experience the Tetons without the summer crowds and their Gore-Tex confidence. I'd promised her transformation, the kind that only comes from sleeping under aspens and waking to frost patterns that look like neural pathways spreading across tent fabric. What I didn't promise, what I couldn't have known to promise, was that we'd be mapping something far older than any geological survey. The afternoon light came sideways through the lodgepole pines, turning everything amber and ancient. I'd led her 4 miles in, following a route I'd memorized so thoroughly, it had become muscle memory. West Fork drainage, across the meadow where elk bones surfaced every spring, like archaeological discoveries, then up into the saddle where the old trail met the new. Except the bones were there wrong. They'd always been scattered, picked clean by seasons and scavengers, but now they formed a line, perfect, deliberate, pointing deeper into the valley. My fiancée noticed my hesitation. She didn't ask why I'd stopped, and I appreciated that about her, the way she trusted the pauses as much as the motion. Instead, she tilted her head, listening, and that's when I realized what had changed. The forest had gone completely silent. Not the comfortable quiet of dusk approaching, but an absolute absence of sound that felt almost textured, like pressing your hands against velvet in a dark room. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through the pines, though I could see the highest branches swaying. The silence had weight to it, had presence, and I caught myself holding my breath as if afraid to disturb something watching us decide which way to go. I pulled out my compass. The needle swung lazily, couldn't seem to settle. North became northeast, became north by northwest in slow, drunken circles. I tapped the housing, checked for metal interference, told myself it was a cheap knockoff even though I'd bought it from the same outfitter that supplied search and rescue. The needle kept wandering. That's when I saw the first marks. They were cut deep into an aspen trunk about 20 yards ahead, 3 parallel gouges running vertically down the white bark. The spacing suggested claws, except they started 11, maybe 12 feet up. I'd seen plenty of bear sign in these mountains. Trees stripped of bark, territorial markings, the occasional claw punctures. But bears, even grizzlies standing on hind legs, couldn't reach that high. And these marks weren't the ragged tears of an animal marking territory. They were too precise, too measured, like someone had taken calipers to the tree and calculated the exact spacing needed to suggest something familiar while being fundamentally wrong. I didn't mention them. Instead, I suggested we take the lower trail, the one that wound through denser forest where the canopy would provide better shelter if weather moved in. She agreed without question, and I hated myself for the lie. There was no weather coming. The sky held that crystalline October clarity that promised cold, but not storms. I wanted the lower trail because it meant we'd reach the valley floor faster, could set camp while we still had light, could zip ourselves into synthetic safety before whatever had marked that tree decided to mark something else. We moved quickly, too quickly for a first-time backpacker, but she kept pace without complaint. Every 100 yards or so, I'd spot another set of marks, always high, always 3 parallel gouges, and always positioned where they'd catch my eye just as I thought we'd left them behind, like breadcrumbs leading us deeper into a story I hadn't agreed to read. The sun dropped behind the western peaks, and the temperature followed it down. My breath began to plume. So did hers. and I watched the vapor curl from her lips with a kind of desperate focus, needing to see proof that we were still fully present, still exhaling carbon dioxide and certainty into air that suddenly felt less like atmosphere and more like observation. We made camp in a sheltered valley where a creek bent around a small clearing. The spot was perfect. Flat ground, water source, natural windbreak from the surrounding pines. Too perfect. The kind of perfect that makes you check your surroundings twice, that makes you wonder why such an ideal site isn't marked on any map, isn't circled in any trail guide. But my legs ached and her face had gone gray with exhaustion, so I pushed the unease down and started unpacking. She built the fire while I set up the tent. We moved in practiced tandem, the kind of coordination that comes from planning a life together, from negotiating who does dishes and who handles finances. Domestic choreography translated to wilderness survival. Except I kept catching myself counting trees, kept losing track of which trunk I'd just looked at, because they all seemed to shift position when I wasn't watching directly. We ate freeze-dried lasagna that tasted like salted cardboard and regret. She asked me about the marks on the trees, her voice carefully casual, the way you ask about strange noises in a new house. I told her it was probably just bear activity, unusual height but not unprecedented. She nodded, spooned another bite, didn't mention that I'd been avoiding eye contact since we'd made camp. The fire popped and sent sparks spiraling into darkness that seemed to press closer with each passing minute. Around 9, we retreated to the tent. I arranged our bear spray, my emergency whistle, and a small bell I normally used for warning wildlife of our presence. She watched me create this arsenal without comment, then wrapped herself in her sleeping bag and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into something like sleep, though I noticed her hands stayed clenched even as her face relaxed. I lay awake, listening. The silence had followed us. It pooled around the tent like water, heavy and cold, and utterly devoid of the usual nighttime chorus. No owls, no rodents rustling through undergrowth. Not even the creek made sound, though I could hear, or thought I could hear, something else. A low-frequency hum, just at the edge of perception, like standing too close to high-voltage lines or pressing your ear against your own pulse. Around 2 in the morning, something began circling our tent. I heard it first as a change in air pressure, the way your ears pop when weather shifts suddenly. Then came the footsteps, if they were footsteps. They moved with disturbing regularity, keeping perfect distance from our shelter, never varying their rhythm. Heavy enough to compress the forest floor, but with a quality that suggested weight without corresponding mass, like watching someone mime walking downstairs. My hand found the bear spray. The other reached for the bell. I rang it once, sharp and clear. The sound cut through the silence like a scalpel through skin. Something answered, not with a growl or a vocalization, but with a sharp crack of breaking wood, the sound of a green branch being snapped deliberately. It came from the direction the footsteps had just passed, which meant whatever had been circling had stopped, had turned toward us, had responded. I rang the bell again. Another crack, this time closer. Then another, moving in a circle that tightened with each response, each one answering my bell with precise timing, like we were having a conversation I didn't remember starting. My fiancée woke. She didn't sit up, didn't speak, just opened her eyes and stared at the tent's ceiling. Her breathing stayed deep and steady, but her pupils had dilated so wide her eyes looked black. I wanted to tell her to stay calm, wanted to explain that we were safe, that bear spray worked on any animal, that my experience would protect us. But I'd stopped believing my own expertise sometime between the 11th and 12th crack of breaking wood. The circling continued for hours, not constantly. It would stop for long stretches, 10 or 15 minutes of that pressing silence, and then resume with renewed purpose. Each time it stopped, I prayed it had left. Each time it started again, I felt something inside me constrict a little tighter, some fundamental belief in the logical world being slowly wrung out like water from cloth. Around 4, something pushed against the tent's rainfly, not a brush or a bump, but a deliberate, exploratory pressure that traveled the length of the tent wall, as if whatever was outside was running its hand, or something hand-shaped, along the fabric. Testing. Measuring. The pressure was firm enough to bend the tent poles slightly inward, to make the nylon creak with tension. It moved with terrible purpose, starting at the head of the tent and working methodically toward the foot, and I realized with dawning horror that it was tracing our shapes, learning our dimensions, mapping us. I lay perfectly still, bear spray forgotten, bell silent in my hand. My fiancée had stopped breathing entirely, or so it seemed. Her chest barely moved, her eyes fixed on the tent ceiling where the fabric pressed inward, outward, following the curve of some invisible examination. I wanted to shout, to make noise, to break whatever spell we'd fallen under. But some deeper instinct kept me frozen, kept me silent because movement felt like permission, like acknowledgement, like opening a door I desperately needed to keep locked. The pressure traveled the entire length of the tent, reached the foot, paused. Then it reversed, slower this time, more careful, as if committing every detail to memory. When it finally withdrew, the relief was almost worse than the violation, because now I knew something had stood inches from us, separated only by a few millimeters of ripstop nylon, and had chosen not to enter. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, like it didn't want to reveal what the night had hidden. I crawled from the tent into air that felt scoured, scrubbed clean of everything except cold and weak sunlight, filtering through high clouds that hadn't been in yesterday's forecast. The first thing I saw was the stones. They'd been arranged in a perfect rectangle, roughly 6 feet by 3 feet, positioned about 10 feet from our tent. But it wasn't until I stood and looked down at them that I understood what I was seeing. The stones formed an outline, our outline, mine and hers, lying side by side, recreated in granite and quartzite with disturbing accuracy. The curve of shoulders, the angle of feet, even the space between our bodies where cold air had settled during the night. It was a map, a diagram, a blueprint of us sleeping, rendered in stone with the kind of precision that suggested careful observation, intimate knowledge, patient documentation. My fiancée emerged from the tent, saw the stones, and made a sound I'd never heard from her before. Not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, something caught between recognition and rejection. I wanted to tell her it was a coincidence, that wind or animals or geological accident had arranged rocks into that particular pattern. But the lie wouldn't form. The stones had been placed, deliberately, by something that had studied us through fabric and darkness and had wanted us to know we'd been measured. We broke camp in silence. Neither of us spoke about the stones, though we both kept glancing at them as we packed, kept checking to make sure they weren't rearranging themselves while we worked. The temperature had dropped further. My thermometer read 28 degrees, cold enough that our breath crystallized instantly, hung in the air like speech bubbles that never filled with words. I checked my compass. The needle spun freely now, making full rotations without any pretense of finding north. I put it away, relied on my knowledge of the terrain, on muscle memory and sun position. We'd retrace our route out. Simple. Direct. We'd be at the trailhead by noon. That's when I saw the tracks. They started at the edge of our clearing and led deeper into the valley. Not toward the trail out, but away from it, into terrain that wasn't on any map I'd memorized. Each print was massive, easily 18 inches long, shaped vaguely like a human footprint, but wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. Too narrow at the heel, too wide at the toes. The stride length suggested something either impossibly tall or moving with a gait that didn't correspond to bipedal locomotion. There were dozens of them, all pointed into the valley, none coming back out. I knelt beside one, trying to identify it, to force it into some category I could name and therefore control. The depth suggested tremendous weight, but the edges were too clean, too sharp, like they'd been pressed into the ground rather than walked. I touched the edge of one print, felt the disturbed earth, and my hand came away with something like static electricity, a tingling sensation that traveled up my arm and lodged somewhere behind my sternum. My fiancée pulled at my sleeve. Her eyes asked the question her mouth couldn't form. What made these? I had no answer, or rather, I had dozens of answers, each one more impossible than the last. So I told her we were leaving. Now. We'd take the trail out at double time, wouldn't stop until we reached the ranger station, would report anomalous wildlife activity, and recommend the trail be temporarily closed for safety assessment. We hiked fast, almost running. The morning sun felt thin, inadequate, like it couldn't quite penetrate to ground level. I kept checking behind us, kept scanning the forest for movement, but saw only trees standing in that peculiar stillness that suggested held breath. My compass stayed useless, spinning in lazy circles whenever I checked it, which I did compulsively, every few minutes, like checking a wound to see if it's still bleeding. 3 hours later, we reached the trailhead. My truck sat exactly where I'd left it, covered in frost that had formed patterns I didn't want to examine too closely. We threw our gear in the bed, climbed into the cab, and I started the engine with shaking hands. The radio came on automatically, some country station playing songs about lost love and found faith, and the normalcy of it nearly broke me. She spoke for the first time since leaving camp, her voice rough from disuse and cold. What do we tell them? I looked at her, really looked. Saw the exhaustion, the confusion, the dawning awareness that we'd both experienced something that had no place in our shared reality. Saw the question underneath her question. Are we going to pretend this didn't happen? Bear activity, I said. Just bear activity. She nodded. We drove to the ranger station in silence, filed our backcountry report, and I wrote exactly what I'd planned to write. Encountered unusual bear sign on October 12th. Recommend trail assessment. The ranger, a kid barely out of college with a name tag that read Jensen, thanked us for our diligence and noted the report in his computer. He asked if we'd felt unsafe at any point. I said no. He asked if we'd seen any actual bears. I said no. He asked if we'd like to recommend any trail improvements. I said no. We walked out into afternoon sunlight that felt like a different universe from the one we'd left 24 hours earlier. She held my hand. Hers was cold, or maybe mine was, or maybe we'd both carried something back from those mountains that would never quite warm up. I drove us home. We unpacked in silence. That night we lay in our own bed, sheets that smelled like detergent and civilization, and didn't speak about what we'd seen. Didn't speak about the stones or the tracks, or the thing that had measured our shapes through synthetic fabric. After a while, she fell asleep. I didn't, because I kept thinking about those tracks, about how they'd all pointed into the valley, away from any known trail, away from any mapped territory, about how none of them had led back out. And I kept thinking about the stones, that perfect outline of our sleeping bodies, rendered with such meticulous accuracy that whoever, whatever, had placed them must have known exactly how we looked from above, must have been watching us from some elevated position, must have been documenting us with the kind of care reserved for specimens, for maps. 3 weeks have passed. We haven't discussed going back, haven't discussed much of anything, really, except in the careful, curated language people use when they're trying to forget something together. She's started sleeping with the lights on. I've started checking our windows before bed, making sure the curtains are fully closed, that there are no gaps where something might look through and study the shape of us sleeping. Last night, I woke at 2 a.m. to find her standing at the bedroom window, staring out at our backyard. I asked her what she was looking at. She didn't turn around, just kept staring, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried that same quality of controlled terror I'd heard in the tent. There are stones, she said, arranged in patterns, like a path, leading from the woods to our house. I got up, looked where she was looking, saw nothing but grass and darkness and the ordinary geometry of suburban safety, told her she was dreaming, still half asleep, that there was nothing there. She nodded, came back to bed, but I saw her hands shaking as she pulled the blankets up, saw the way she positioned herself so she could keep one eye on the window, and I wondered if she'd actually been dreaming, or if she'd seen something I couldn't, or wouldn't. This morning, I went outside to check the backyard, found nothing unusual, no stones, no tracks, just wet grass and fallen leaves and the residue of frost that would melt by noon. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tree line where our property met the woods, and I tried to convince myself that we'd left it all behind in the Tetons, that whatever had measured us, Whatever had mapped us, whatever had watched us through darkness and fabric and fear, it had stayed in those mountains, in that valley, in that silence that still sometimes fills my ears when I'm trying to fall asleep. But my compass, the one I'd used in the Tetons, the one that had spun uselessly through our entire ordeal, sits on my desk now. I check it sometimes, when I'm alone, when the house is quiet and she's at work, and there's no one to see me indulge this particular paranoia. The needle doesn't point north anymore. It points toward our bedroom, and every night, it seems to have moved a few degrees closer. Story 2. My grandfather used to tell me stories in 2 languages, his Yupik words flowing like dark water between the English ones I'd learned in school. He'd sit by the wood stove in his cabin outside Bethel, whittling birch branches into fishing lures, and talk about the Chiliamta Aput, the stick men who walked between the willows when the wind blew just right. He never called them spirits or demons, just men. Men made of old wood and bad intentions, who knew your name before you knew theirs. I was 7 when he first warned me. We'd been checking his fish wheel on the Kuskokwim, and he stopped mid-step on the riverbank, his weathered hand gripping my shoulder hard enough to hurt. The willows along the water were thrashing in a wind I couldn't feel, and through their motion came a sound like dry fingers snapping, like someone shuffling a deck of old bones. He told me then, if the willows ever call your name, your real name, the one only family knows, you walk toward water, not toward the voice. Water runs one direction. Voices can come from anywhere. I thought about those words every time I visited him, right up until the stroke took his speech away 2 winters ago. He'd try to tell me something in those final weeks, his mouth working around sounds that wouldn't form, his eyes tracking something in the corner of the room that I couldn't see. The hospice nurse said it was common, this looking at nothing. The morphine played tricks, but I knew what he was seeing. The job posting for the wetland monitoring project in Fairbanks came through in March, just as the breakup started. I needed the work, needed the distraction more than the money, if I'm honest. And the Bureau of Land Management wasn't asking questions about why a guy with my credentials was willing to spend 2 months alone in the backcountry installing sensors in permafrost bogs. They just wanted someone who could handle the cold, the isolation, and the mosquitoes. Someone who wouldn't quit after the first week of sleeping in a tent, with only the wind for company. I told myself it would be different. Fairbanks was interior Alaska, not the coastal tundra where my grandfather's people came from. Different tribes, different stories, different spirits. The willows grew here too, Salix species, the same slender branches and silver-green leaves. But they weren't the same willows. That's what I told myself. The site was designated on my map as Sector 7, a braided stream complex about 30 miles southeast of the city, accessible only by bush plane or a brutal ATV ride through terrain that would swallow you whole if you lost the trail. I chose the plane. The pilot who dropped me off on a gravel bar was a grizzled woman named Dina, who'd been flying the interior for 30 years. She helped me unload the cases of equipment, the solar panels, the weather-resistant housing for the data loggers. She looked at the tree line where the black spruce gave way to willow thickets and made a sound in her throat. Not quite disapproval, more like recognition. "You Yupik?" she asked. "Half," I said, "on my mother's side." She nodded slowly, her eyes still on the willows. "You know the stories then?" "I know them." "Good." She climbed back into the cockpit. "Radio check every 48 hours. Miss 2 calls, I come get you whether you want it or not." The plane's engine drowned out whatever else she might have said, and then I was alone with 60 pounds of equipment and 3 weeks of food, standing on a gravel bar in the kind of silence that isn't really silent at all. The first 3 days were routine. I established my base camp on high ground, upwind from the boggy sections where the sensors needed to go. The work was methodical: drill into the permafrost, install the thermistors at varying depths, connect them to the data logger, secure everything against weather and wildlife. By the time I started on the willow sections, I'd settled into the rhythm of it, the physical exhaustion that made sleep come easy. despite the midnight sun hanging in the sky like a watching eye. The willows grew densest along the stream channels, their roots anchored in the perennially frozen ground, their branches reaching up in tangled profusion. To get the sensors placed correctly, I had to wade through thickets where the stems grew so close together they formed living walls. The work was slow, claustrophobic. I'd mark my path with numbered stakes, bright orange flags on 4-foot poles, so I could find my way back to the equipment cases for batteries and cables. On the 4th day, I installed stakes 1 through 12 in a rough line from the edge of the willow thicket to a clearing about 200 yards in. The clearing was eerily perfect, a circle of bare ground where nothing grew, surrounded by willows so dense they formed an almost solid barrier. I made a note in my field book: investigate soil composition, possible contamination or pH anomaly. Then I marked the clearing's center with stake 13 and headed back to camp as the afternoon wind picked up. That was when I first heard the sound. It came from deep in the willows to my left, a dry, rattling percussion, like someone shaking a bundle of hollow reeds, or like someone walking through dead branches. The rational part of my brain cataloged it automatically. Wind through dry wood, nothing more. But the sound had rhythm, pattern. It rose and fell in a cadence that felt deliberate, and beneath it ran a softer noise, almost like whispering. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. The silence that followed had weight to it, a pressure against my eardrums that made me want to swallow, to equalize something that couldn't be equalized. I could feel my pulse in my throat, in my fingertips. The willows around me stood motionless despite the wind I could hear moving through the spruce canopy above. Then my grandfather's voice spoke my middle name. Not his exact voice, not his living voice, with its rough edges and the way he'd roll certain consonants in the back of his throat. This was thinner, drier, like an audio recording played through old speakers. But it was him. The pronunciation, the inflection, the specific way he'd always emphasized the second syllable when he was serious, when he wanted my attention. My legs carried me forward without conscious thought, away from the sound, toward the creek I could hear burbling somewhere ahead. I didn't run. Running in the backcountry is how people break ankles and die of exposure. But I walked fast, my breath coming hard, my eyes scanning for the orange flags of my stake line. Stake 12, stake 11. The numbers counted down as I retraced my path, and the rational part of my brain was already constructing explanations. Auditory pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to find patterns in random noise. Stress, lack of sleep. The memory of my grandfather so fresh that of course I'd imagine his voice in the wind. But when I reached stake 8, my hands started shaking. The stake had been moved. Not fallen. Moved. It stood upright, firmly planted, the orange flag snapping in a breeze I still couldn't feel on my skin. But it was 20 feet off the line, positioned at the edge of a narrow gap between 2 willow clumps, an opening I didn't remember seeing before. Stakes 7 and 6 had been moved too. They formed a path now, a corridor leading away from my original line, deeper into the thicket, toward the clearing I'd marked with stake 13. I stood there for what might have been 30 seconds or 30 minutes, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I'd planted those stakes myself less than 4 hours ago. I'd driven them into the frozen ground with a rubber mallet, checked their alignment with my GPS unit. They'd been exactly where they needed to be. The wind picked up. The willows around me began to sway, and that rattling sound started again, closer now, coming from multiple directions. And underneath it, woven through it like a secondary melody, came the whispers. They were saying my name. Both names. The English one I used for work, for official documents, for the world outside my grandfather's cabin, and the Yupik one, the one my mother had chosen, the one I'd never told anyone here. I ran. Forget the backcountry safety rules. Forget the careful navigation. Forget everything except the animal knowledge that when something knows your true name and you didn't tell them, you run. The willows blurred past me, branches whipping at my face and arms, the ground uneven and treacherous under my boots. I could hear the rattling behind me now, and beside me, and ahead of me, multiplying, surrounding, a percussion section from a nightmare orchestra. The voices came from everywhere and nowhere. They overlapped, creating harmonics that shouldn't exist in nature, frequencies that made my teeth ache and my vision swim. I stumbled, caught myself on a willow stem that felt wrong under my palm, too warm, too yielding, almost like skin over bone. I snatched my hand back and kept moving, trying to orient myself by memory, by instinct, by anything except the sounds that were definitely, absolutely guiding me in circles. The sun was still up but lower now, casting long shadows through the thicket, and the shadows moved wrong, jerking and stuttering like footage with frames missing. My grandfather's voice rose above the others, clearer now, speaking in Yupik, words I only half remembered, from bedtime stories and warnings, from prayers he'd whisper when the wind blew too hard against the cabin walls. He was telling me something important. He was trying to warn me, or he was trying to lead me somewhere I shouldn't go. Water runs one direction. The thought cut through my panic like a blade. I stopped, chest heaving, and listened past the voices, past the rattling willows, past my own ragged breathing. There, faint but steady, the sound of running water. Not the whisper hiss of wind through branches, but the actual gurgle and splash of a stream over rocks. I turned toward it, away from the clearest voice, away from what sounded like my grandfather calling me home. The willows fought me, branches catching at my clothes and hair, roots grabbing at my boots. The rattling intensified, became almost frantic, and for just a moment I saw something in my peripheral vision, a shape among the stems, tall and impossibly thin, assembled from branches and bad intentions, with gaps where joints should be and hollow spaces where a face might form. I didn't look directly at it. I kept my eyes on the ground ahead, on my boots, on the water sound that grew louder with each step. The willows thinned, the ground firmed up, and then I was stumbling out onto a gravel bar I recognized, the creek running fast and cold just a few feet away, flowing northwest toward the Tanana River. The voices stopped. The wind died. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own gasping breaths, the hammer of my heart, the neutral commentary of the creek doing what water always does, running downhill, one direction, following the laws of physics that don't change when you're terrified. I followed it downstream for 2 miles before I felt safe enough to cut back toward my base camp. The sun hung in the sky like it always did, indifferent to my terror. By the time I reached my tent, I'd almost convinced myself I'd panicked over nothing. Heat exhaustion, maybe. Dehydration. A bad reaction to the energy bars I'd been living on. Almost. I radioed Dina that night and told her everything was fine. The lie came easily. What was I going to say? That my dead grandfather's voice had called me into the willows, that something had moved my survey stakes. She'd have pulled me out, marked me down as another case of bush fever, another city worker who couldn't hack the isolation. Instead, I said the installation was going well, that I'd have the sensors fully deployed within a week. She acknowledged and signed off, and I sat in my tent listening to the wind move through the spruce forest, waiting for it to reach the willows. When it did, I heard nothing. Just wind. Just trees. I told myself I'd imagined the rest. The next morning, I forced myself to go back to the site. The sensors needed data verification, and I had 3 weeks of work left on my contract. I couldn't afford to fail, couldn't afford the questions that would come if I abandoned the project. And part of me, the stubborn part, the part that had spent too many years proving I could handle anything Alaska threw at me, refused to be chased off by voices in the wind. The survey stakes were exactly where I'd left them the day before. Not where I'd planted them originally, but where they'd been moved to, forming that corridor through the willows leading to the clearing. I stared at them for a long time, my GPS unit in hand, comparing coordinates to my field notes. The discrepancy was undeniable. These stakes were not where I'd put them, but they were also exactly where they'd been when I ran. They hadn't moved back. They hadn't been disturbed further. They were waiting. I gathered my equipment, the sensors I hadn't installed, the solar panels, the cables and mounting hardware. It took me 6 hours to collect everything from that sector, working in complete silence, my eyes tracking every movement in my peripheral vision, my ears straining for any sound that wasn't natural. The willows stood still. The clearing, when I finally reached it, was empty except for stake 13, standing exactly where I'd planted it. In the bare dirt around the stake, I saw footprints. Not boot prints, not animal tracks. These were narrow impressions, like someone walking on stilts, or like the marks a bundle of bound sticks might make if it learned to walk. They circled the stake in a spiral pattern that tightened toward the center, then led away into the thicket, toward deeper darkness where the willows grew so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in. I left the stake there, left all of them, carried my equipment back to base camp, broke down my tent, and packed everything I could carry into my backpack. The rest I cached under a tarp marked on my GPS. Dina wasn't scheduled to pick me up for another 2 weeks, but I hiked to the nearest accessible gravel bar and camped there, within sight of the river, where I could see anything approaching from miles away. When she finally came for me, right on schedule, she took one look at my face and didn't ask questions. We loaded my gear in silence. As the plane lifted off, I looked down at the willow thickets, at the braided streams and the clearing I'd marked with stake 13. The clearing wasn't empty. There were shapes there, dozens of them, tall and thin and absolutely still, arranged in a circle like they were waiting for something, or like they'd finished waiting, and whatever they'd wanted to happen had already happened. The lab analysis of my soil samples came back 3 weeks later. Everything was normal except for the pollen counts. According to the report, I'd collected samples containing pollen from Salix lanata, Arctic woolly willow, a species that grows in coastal Alaska in the tundra regions where my grandfather's people lived. It doesn't grow in the interior, not naturally, not this far south. The environmental scientist who processed my samples called it contamination, probable field mixing of specimens. She suggested I be more careful about cleaning my tools between sites. I thanked her and hung up, staring at the bright orange survey flags I'd kept from the project, now leaning in the corner of my apartment. They'd been with me in Fairbanks. They'd never been to the coast, but the pollen had. Or the pollen knew where I was from. Knew what would grow in the place my grandfather used to tell his stories, where the willows along the Kuskokwim spoke names in the wind, and men made of old wood walked when the weather turned strange. Last week, the wind shifted here in town. It came from the north, carrying the scent of autumn and changes I couldn't name. And in that wind, moving through the ornamental willows planted along the walking trail near my building, I heard something. Not words. Not yet. But a rattling. A rhythm. The beginning of a pattern that might, if I listened long enough, resolve itself into speech. I went inside, closed the windows, turned on music loud enough to drown out the wind. But at night, when the building is quiet and the breeze picks up, I still hear it sometimes. My middle name, spoken in my grandfather's voice, or in something using his voice, calling from somewhere I can't see, inviting me to come back, to finish the work I started, to step into that clearing and learn what the willow men wanted to show me. My grandfather told me once that some doors, once opened, never fully close. That some names, once heard in the wrong place, create a connection that distance can't break. I don't go near willows anymore, not if I can help it. But they know where I live. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I think I see them at the edge of my vision. Tall, thin shapes assembled from shadows and branches, standing patient in the gaps between streetlights, waiting for me to stop running toward water, to turn around and finally answer when they call my name. Story 3. The irrigation bridge shouldn't have existed at all. Not on any county map. Not in any official record. My friend found it mentioned in a thread on some paranormal forum, buried under 3 pages of the usual nonsense about UFOs and government conspiracies. But there was something about the way the original poster described it that caught his attention. Motors fail at midnight, always midnight, and the water sounds wrong. We'd been friends since college, bonded over late-night drives and an appetite for the unexplained that never quite matured into adulthood, along with the rest of us. He worked IT now. I sold insurance. Both of us had mortgages and responsibilities and that quiet, grinding awareness that we were getting older without getting anywhere interesting. So when he showed me the post over beers one Thursday, I didn't need much convincing. The bridge was on tribal land, technically off limits without permission, but the forum post included coordinates and the assurance that nobody bothered to patrol it anymore. Something about budget cuts and jurisdictional disputes. The structure itself was a relic from the 30s, built to redirect creek water during the Dust Bowl years, and supposedly abandoned when the irrigation projects shifted to modern pump systems. But locals claimed it was something else, that the tribe had specifically asked for it to be left alone, unmaintained, slowly returning to the earth. We left on a Saturday, my V6 humming along Highway 47, as afternoon bled into dusk. My friend rode shotgun, scrolling through his phone for any additional information he could find, muttering fragments of half-formed theories. The reservation boundary came up suddenly, marked by a hand-painted sign and a dirt road that split off from the asphalt like a scar. The transition was immediate and unsettling. Paved road became hardpack and gravel, and the landscape seemed to fold inward, trees pressing closer on both sides. My headlights caught dust motes that hung suspended in the air with unnatural stillness, and the usual highway sounds, the white noise of other traffic, the distant rumble of civilization, cut off completely. We might have been driving into a pocket dimension, sealed away from everything familiar. Neither of us spoke much during that last stretch. The silence felt deliberate, like something we shouldn't disturb. My friend eventually lowered his phone, the screen's glow the only light besides my dashboard, and stared out the windshield with an expression I couldn't quite read. The bridge appeared around a bend, and I eased off the gas without thinking. It was smaller than I'd expected, a narrow span of weathered concrete and rusted rebar that stretched maybe 30 feet across a channel cut deep into the earth. Water moved below, catching moonlight in brief, silvered flashes, but the sound of it, the rush and tumble you'd expect, was absent. Or not absent exactly, muffled, like someone had thrown a blanket over the entire creek. I pulled onto the bridge's approach, concrete cracked and sprouting weeds through every fissure, and checked my watch. 11:42. We'd timed it right, if timing mattered, if any of this was real. The engine ticked as it cooled, and we sat there, two grown men in a pickup truck, waiting for midnight like teenagers at a cemetery gate. My friend suggested we get out, stretch our legs, maybe walk the bridge's length to get a better look at the water. I agreed, though something in my gut twisted at the idea. Outside, the air tasted metallic and old. The bridge's surface was worse than it looked from inside the cab, pitted and stained, with gaps where whole sections had crumbled away. I could see down into the channel, maybe 15 feet to where the water moved with that same wrong, muted quality. The creek bed itself seemed wider than the water flow warranted, like something had carved out extra space and left it empty. My friend walked ahead, his phone's flashlight beam cutting weak paths through the darkness. He stopped at the bridge's center, looking down, and I heard him say something about the current being unusual, too fast in some places, too slow in others, following no pattern that made sense. I joined him, peering over the edge, and that's when I noticed the smell. Wet earth and rust, but underneath it something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in a warm place. I mentioned it to my friend, and he nodded slowly, his face pale in the phone's reflected glow. We walked back to the truck, and I checked my watch again. 11:56. The last 4 minutes stretched like hours. We sat with the doors locked, windows cracked just enough to let in air, and waited. My friend tried to make conversation, nervous rambling about the forum post and what we might actually witness, but his voice sounded thin and unconvincing. I kept my eyes on the dashboard clock, watching the digital numbers crawl forward. 11:59. Midnight. Nothing happened. The engine kept its low, idle rumble. The dashboard lights stayed bright, and the world outside remained exactly as it was. My friend laughed, a quick burst of relief, and reached for the door handle. He suggested we'd been worked up over nothing, that we should... The engine died. Not sputtered, not coughed, just stopped, mid-cycle, like someone had reached into the hood and yanked out a vital piece. The dashboard light stayed on, glowing steady and impossible, but the ignition was completely dead. I turned the key, felt it click uselessly, tried again. Nothing. My friend's laugh cut off. Outside, the silence deepened into something physical, a pressure against my eardrums. The water below had stopped making even its muted sound. Total absence, like the creek had frozen mid-flow. That's when I saw it. At the very edge of my headlight's reach, something moved. Low to the ground, four-legged, emerging from the brush on the far side of the bridge. At first, I thought it was a dog, maybe a stray or someone's lost pet, but as it limped into better light, dragging one hind leg behind it, I realized how wrong that assumption was. The thing had no hair. Its skin was gray-pink and loose, hanging in folds around its skeletal frame. The head was too large, the snout too short, and when it turned toward us, I saw that its eyes caught the light wrong. Not the reflective gleam you'd expect from an animal, but something flat and absorptive, like staring into dead screens. My friend whispered something I didn't catch. The creature, I couldn't think of it as a dog anymore, stood at the bridge's entrance, swaying slightly, its breathing visible as condensation in the cool air. But the rhythm was off, too slow, each exhale lasting far longer than it should. I did something stupid. Some primitive part of my brain decided that making noise would help, would scare it off, or break whatever spell had settled over the bridge. I hit the horn. The blast echoed across the empty landscape, harsh and immediate. And the creature reacted. It rose. Not stood up, rose. Its spine elongated impossibly, vertebrae cracking and popping as the thing stretched upward and upward, front legs extending like telescoping rods. In seconds, it had gone from slouched and dog-sized to something tall enough to look over my hood, its malformed head now level with the windshield. The loose skin pulled taut, revealing angular joints and a skeletal structure that made no anatomical sense. We didn't breathe, didn't move. The thing's flat eyes fixed on us through the glass, and I had the terrible certainty that it saw more than just two men in a truck. It saw something deeper, something vulnerable and exposed that I didn't know I was showing. The moment stretched, elastic and cruel. Then at the far end of the bridge, headlights appeared. The beams cut through the darkness, distant but approaching, and the creature's head swiveled toward them with a motion that bent at angles nothing with a spine should manage. For a heartbeat, it remained frozen in that impossible height, and I thought I saw its mouth working, lips pulling back from teeth that were too numerous and too sharp. Then it collapsed. Not fell. Collapsed, like air rushing out of a balloon. The height vanished, the spine compressed back into something approximately dog-shaped, and it scrambled away on all fours, disappearing into the brush with a rustling that sounded almost relieved. The approaching vehicle was a pickup, older than mine, with a rattling diesel engine that grew louder as it pulled alongside. I couldn't see the driver clearly through the glare of their headlights, just a silhouette that sat still for a moment before flashing their high beams twice. My friend found his voice, suggested we try the ignition. My hands shook as I turned the key, expecting nothing, but the engine caught immediately, smooth and strong like it had never died at all. The other truck didn't move, just idled there, headlights pointed at us, waiting. I put mine in reverse, backed off the bridge, and turned around on the narrow road. As we passed, I glimpsed the driver, an older man, weathered face shadowed by a baseball cap, expression neutral and knowing in a way that made my skin crawl. We drove in silence for maybe 10 minutes before the radio crackled to life. We hadn't turned it on. The static resolved briefly into something that might have been crying, high-pitched and desperate, the sound an infant makes when hungry or scared or alone. My friend lunged for the volume knob, but the crying cut off before he reached it, replaced by ordinary static that faded as quickly as it had come. He suggested we'd imagined it, stress and adrenaline playing tricks. I didn't answer, couldn't really, and because I'd been watching the road, And in that brief moment when the crying filled the cab, I'd seen something in the rearview mirror, just a flicker, easily dismissed, that looked like the creature from the bridge, standing on two legs in the middle of the road behind us, watching us leave. We didn't talk about it afterward. Not really. He sent me a few texts the following week, links to articles about mass hallucinations and infrasound causing paranoia. I sent back non-committal responses and let the conversation die. But I knew, and I think he knew, that we were just performing the ritual of rational explanation, going through the motions because admitting the alternative was impossible. I did go back once, 2 weeks later, alone, in daylight. The bridge looked harmless under afternoon sun, just old concrete and weeds. I didn't get out of the truck, didn't even slow down much, but as I passed I saw someone standing on the shoulder, a woman from the tribe, maybe 40 or 50, wearing a denim jacket and watching the road with patient expectation. She flagged me down. I stopped because refusing felt worse than whatever she might say. Her voice was kind when she spoke, gently suggesting I not return. She said the bridge had history, the kind that didn't care about intentions or curiosity. She said the water had voices and some people heard them without meaning to, without wanting to, and once you heard them, they remembered you. I asked what she meant. She just smiled, sad and knowing, and told me to drive safe, to stay on paved roads after dark, to maybe find a different hobby than looking for places like this. I took her advice. Haven't been back. Haven't even driven through that part of the state. My friend moved to Colorado 3 months later, took a job that paid less but required relocation, and we haven't spoken since beyond the occasional social media post. But sometimes late at night when sleep won't come, I think about the bridge, about the water that ran silent, about the thing that rose impossibly tall and looked at me with dead screen eyes. And I think about the woman's words, that the voices remember. Because last month, my bathroom sink started making sounds at night, just after midnight. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could record or prove. Just a faint, almost crying quality to the water as it moves through old pipes. My wife sleeps through it, says I'm imagining things, that I need to see someone about my stress levels. She's probably right. The rational part of me, the part that sells insurance and pays mortgages and lives a normal life, agrees completely. But the other part, the part that drove onto that bridge and saw something impossible, knows better. It recognizes the crying quality in the pipes. The way it sounds almost familiar, almost like something I heard before in a truck cab with static-filled speakers. The water remembers. And late at night, lying awake while my wife sleeps peacefully beside me, I wonder if I'm the one who's forgotten. Forgotten what I really saw, what really looked back at me from that bridge, what might have followed me home through the pipes and the wires, and all the invisible threads that connect our modern world. I wonder if forgetting is even possible, or if the voices of the water are patient, content to wait in the quiet spaces of my life, reminding me in small ways that some doors, once opened, never really close again. Story 4. The old logging trail smelled like October, wet bark and dying leaves, that sweet rot that comes before the first snow. I'd been running these woods for 3 months, ever since the transfer brought me to this corner of Michigan where the cell signal died 2 miles from anywhere that mattered. State Route 55 was my turnaround point, a strip of cracked asphalt that bisected the forest like a scar. 4 miles out, 4 miles back. Simple geometry for a simple escape. The watch on my wrist tracked everything: heart rate, pace, elevation, the precise longitude of my solitude. Technology had become my only companion since the move, since the empty house and the empty rooms, and the particular silence that comes from having no one to break it with. The numbers didn't judge. They just measured. I was 2 miles in when the afternoon light started to fail early, filtered through the canopy into that peculiar amber that makes everything look slightly wrong, slightly staged. The trail here curved around a dense cluster of maples, their trunks thick enough that 3 men couldn't link hands around them. My breathing had found its rhythm. that meditative cadence where thought dissolves into motion. Then I saw the head. It appeared from behind the largest maple, a glimpse of something matted and dark, easily 8 feet off the ground. Too high. The thought arrived with absolute clarity, clinical and cold. No person stood that tall. The shape withdrew before my mind could process the details, leaving only an impression. Fur or hair, something organic and wrong. I stopped. My shoes scraped against the packed dirt, scattering pebbles into the underbrush. The forest had gone quiet in that way that forests shouldn't. No birds, no insects, no rustle of small things fleeing. Just the sound of my own breath, suddenly too loud in my ears. "Hello," my voice cracked the silence like breaking glass. "Is someone there?" The response came as movement, not sound. 3 distinct impacts against the forest floor, heavy enough that I felt them through my feet. Whatever made them was parallel to the trail, matching my position but deeper in the trees. The rhythm was wrong for a deer, too measured, too deliberate. I started running again, faster now, and the sounds kept pace. Not following, accompanying, staying level with me as I pushed my speed, the footfalls maintaining their precise offset. 20 feet into the trees, I estimated, maybe 25, close enough to track, far enough to remain unseen. My watch buzzed against my wrist, heart rate climbing. The screen showed 148 BPM, edging toward the red zone, but I didn't feel winded. I felt observed. The trail straightened out for a long stretch, giving me clear sight lines ahead and behind. Nothing. Just the narrow corridor of packed earth and the walls of trees pressing in from both sides. But the sounds continued, that steady 3-beat pattern matching my stride. Step, 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 pause. Step, 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 pause. Like a metronome set to match my panic. I tried to rationalize it. A bear, maybe, despite the season being wrong for them to be active at this time of day. A hiker staying off the trail for reasons of their own. Someone's dog, though no dog I knew moved with that weight, that intention. Each explanation felt like a lie the moment I constructed it. The forest opened up as I approached Route 55, the trees thinning into a weedy margin before the asphalt. I could see the faded yellow lines, the sun-bleached pavement, the ordinary geometry of human infrastructure. Safety lay in that strip of road, in its promise of passing cars and witnesses, and the thin veneer of civilization we pretend protects us from darker things. I was 20 yards from the road when my watch buzzed again. Heart rate, 172 BPM, dangerous territory. The kind of spike that preceded cardiac events, that brought runners down on sunny days for no reason medical examiners could later explain. But I still felt fine. Better than fine. I felt electrified. Every nerve firing, every sense sharpened to a point that bordered on painful. I wasn't tired. I was terrified, and my body knew it before my mind could catch up. The sounds in the trees had stopped. I slowed to a walk, scanning the underbrush, trying to locate what had been pacing me. The silence felt deliberate now, weighted with intention. Something was making a choice to be quiet, to hold still, to wait. Then I heard it. An engine approaching from the south, the low rumble of a vehicle moving too fast for the curve of the road. I stepped onto the shoulder just as a sedan came into view, a gray domestic model driven by someone whose face I couldn't see through the glare on the windshield. The car approached my position. I raised my hand in a half wave, a gesture toward normalcy, toward human connection. The driver would see me. We would acknowledge each other. The world would snap back into place. The brakes screamed. The sedan shuddered to a stop 15 feet from where I stood, tires leaving black ribbons on the asphalt. The horn blared once, twice, a sound of alarm and confusion. But the driver wasn't looking at me. They were looking at the road directly in front of their bumper, at the empty space where nothing stood. Nothing I could see, but I felt it. A displacement of air across my face, a pressure wave that carried the smell of wet fur and something deeper, something that triggered memory of childhood fears and ancestral warnings coded into DNA. The presence, whatever it was, had crossed between me and the car, had crossed the road entirely, while remaining invisible to my eyes. The sedan sat there for 3 heartbeats, engine running, brake lights casting red over the pavement. Then the driver gunned it, tires squealing as they accelerated away, leaving me alone on the shoulder with the smell of burned rubber and that other scent, that wrongness, still lingering in the air. I turned back toward the forest. The trees looked different now. The spaces between them seemed deeper, more numerous, as if the woods had quietly rearranged themselves while I wasn't looking. The trail entrance gaped like a mouth, inviting me back into its throat. Complete silence, not even wind. I checked my watch. The data stream showed my heart rate at 142 BPM, elevated but not critical. Normal for someone who'd just witnessed a near accident, whose body was processing adrenaline and confusion. The graph showed the expected spike, the sharp climb as my pulse responded to threat. But when I scrolled back through the timeline, my breath caught. The spike had started 10 seconds before the car appeared. 10 seconds before I'd heard the engine, before I'd stepped onto the shoulder, before anything had happened that should have triggered a physiological response. The graph showed my heart rate jumping from a steady 135 to 172 in a single data point, then beginning to climb even higher, and the timestamp placed it in the final seconds before I'd emerged from the trees. My body had known. Before I'd seen the car, before I'd felt the displacement of air, before any rational stimulus existed, my body had registered the danger and responded. Or something had. I stood on that shoulder for longer than I should have, watching the forest, waiting for some resolution that never came. Eventually, the cold drove me back into motion. I started jogging toward home, taking the road instead of the trail, keeping to the pavement where cars might pass and provide witnesses to whatever came next. Nothing followed me on the road. The run home was ordinary, tedious even, just mile after mile of faded asphalt and rural poverty. Trailers set back from the road, junked cars in yards, the slow collapse of an economy that had moved on and left these places to rot. I'd never been so grateful for human decay, for the proof that people existed out here, that I wasn't alone in some pocket dimension wearing the skin of rural Michigan. But when I got home and synced my watch to the computer, the data told a different story. The route map showed my path out to Route 55, accurate to within a few feet, the red line tracking every turn and straightaway. But the return journey looked wrong. The line flickered and jumped, suggesting I'd teleported through several sections of road, skipping distances that should have taken minutes to cover. My pace showed impossible variations, 4:30 per mile, then 9:15, then 3:45, numbers that made no sense for a steady jog on flat pavement. And the section of trail where I'd heard the footsteps, where I'd been paced by something in the trees, that portion showed a time 3 minutes faster than I'd ever managed. Faster than I could manage, even at a sprint, as if I'd been running from something, or with something, or... I closed the laptop. The house felt too empty that night. I kept the lights on in every room, a wasteful grid of illumination that did nothing to dispel the conviction that I was being watched. Several times I went to the windows, cupping my hands against the glass to peer out into the darkness, half expecting to see something peering back. But there was only my reflection, tired and uncertain, a man who'd run 4 miles and couldn't shake the feeling that he'd brought something home with him. Sleep came late and brought dreams of running, always running, through tunnels of trees that never ended. And in the dreams, I could hear the footsteps keeping pace, that 3-beat rhythm matching my stride, staying just out of sight but never falling behind. When I looked at my watch in the dream, the numbers ran backwards, counting down to something I didn't want to reach. I woke to daylight, and the conviction that I'd dreamed the whole thing. Exhaustion, dehydration, some transient break with reality that exercise could trigger. There were explanations. There were always explanations. But when I went for my next run 3 days later, avoiding the logging trail and sticking to the road, my watch started acting up 2 miles from home. The heart rate monitor spiked to 180 for no reason, held there for exactly 10 seconds, then dropped back to normal. I felt fine the entire time. My breathing stayed steady. My legs kept their rhythm. Everything was ordinary except for the numbers. And in the distance, barely audible over my own footfalls. I heard it. 3 heavy impacts against earth, keeping pace, staying level, matching my speed with perfect precision. I haven't stopped running. Stopping feels dangerous in a way I can't articulate. But every route I take now, every path through every stretch of woods or empty road, generates the same corrupted data, times that don't match my effort. Heart rate spikes that precede rather than follow stress. And always, somewhere in the noise of the world, that 3-beat rhythm tracking me. The watch claims I'm getting faster. Each run records better times, shorter miles, impossible paces. Last week I supposedly covered 8 miles in 32 minutes, a pace that would qualify me for the Olympics, that would make me something other than human. I've stopped checking the data. The numbers lie, or they tell a truth I'm not ready to accept. Instead, I just run, and try not to think about what's keeping pace with me. What's been matching my stride since that October afternoon when I saw something that shouldn't exist and felt my body respond to danger before danger arrived. The logging trail is still there, still waiting. Sometimes I drive past it on my way to somewhere else, and I see other runners heading into those trees, their watches tracking their routes, their hearts beating out their simple rhythms. I wonder if they'll feel it too. That moment when the forest goes quiet and something tall and impossible watches from behind a maple tree. I wonder if they'll check their data afterward and see what I see. Evidence that whatever we're running from knows we're coming before we do. That it's been waiting. That it's still waiting. And I wonder, late at night when sleep won't come and the house feels too big around me, if I'm running at all anymore. Or if I'm being pulled, drawn along an invisible string towards something that's been patient, so patient, measuring out the distance 1 3-beat rhythm at a time. My watch is charging on the nightstand. In the darkness, its screen glows with tomorrow's scheduled run. 8 miles, out and back, Route 55 as the turnaround point. The same route I've avoided for weeks. I didn't set that schedule, but I know I'll run it anyway. Because the alternative is to stop, to stand still, to let whatever has been pacing me finally catch up. And my body already knows, the way it knew 10 seconds before the car appeared, that standing still is not an option. It never was. Story 5. The desert doesn't sleep. It waits. I learned that distinction my 3rd week in Nevada, helping old Garrett pull water lines to a livestock trough near the shallow end of Walker Lake. The kind of work city money doesn't prepare you for, but the kind that keeps you from thinking too hard about why you left San Francisco with nothing but a duffel bag and a truck that barely made it past Reno. The night it happened, the air tasted like copper and salt, strange for a place so far from any ocean. But the ancient lake bed held memories in its dust, secrets that predated the cattlemen and the highway, and probably even the Paiute, who knew better than to build anything permanent this close to the water's edge. Garrett had called me around 9, his voice crackling through a connection that seemed to bend and warp with distance, saying the pump housing had cracked and we needed to get it fixed before morning or risk losing the whole herd's water supply. I drove out in my pickup, headlights cutting through darkness so complete it felt textured, like you could reach out and touch the black. The ranch road was barely more than tire ruts through hardpan and sage, winding toward the property's northern edge where Garrett kept his night pasture. The lake sprawled somewhere beyond, invisible except for the way the starlight seemed to stop at a certain point, absorbed by something that gave nothing back. Garrett's truck was already there when I arrived, parked at an angle with its high beams aimed at the trough. He stood beside it, work gloves on, tools laid out on the tailgate. A man in his 70s who moved like the land itself had taught him economy. He raised one hand in greeting but didn't smile. Garrett never smiled much, but that night his face carried something else, a tightness around the eyes that suggested he was listening to something I couldn't yet hear. The work was straightforward enough. Disconnect the old housing, seal the crack with marine epoxy, wait for it to cure. We'd brought battery-powered work lights, but Garrett insisted on leaving his truck's headlights on, aimed not just at our workspace but sweeping out toward the marshy ground between us and the lake. The waste of battery seemed unlike him, but I didn't question it. Not then. About 20 minutes in, while I was holding the housing steady and Garrett was applying the sealant, I became aware of a smell, not the expected sense of mud and livestock and machine oil, but something underneath, organic and wrong, like meat left too long in water that wasn't quite cold enough. I shifted my position, trying to breathe through my mouth, and that's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a rock, round, dark, half submerged in the mudflat about 15 feet from where the truck's headlights made their last real stand against the darkness. The kind of smooth stone that water works on over centuries, except this far from any river, it seemed out of place. I stared at it while Garrett worked, some instinct I didn't recognize telling me to keep watching, to mark its position, to not look away. Then it blinked. Not the way a person blinks, with lids that close from top and bottom. This was sideways, a membranous film sliding across from the sides, and in that half second of movement I saw what I'd mistaken for dark stone was actually an eye, large, amber in the headlight's reflection, with a pupil that wasn't quite round, more like a keyhole turned on its side. My hands went numb. The housing slipped an inch before I caught it, and Garrett made a small sound of irritation, focused on his work, not seeing what I saw. Or maybe he'd already seen it, and that's why he'd positioned the truck the way he had, why his jaw was set like a man expecting bad weather. The thing, I couldn't call it anything else, began to move. Not with the jerky panic of a frightened animal, but with a liquid patience that suggested it had been watching us long before we noticed it. The mud around it seemed to sigh as it pulled itself forward, revealing a body low and broad, skin that looked slick even in the dust, mottled in shades that shifted between brown and gray, and something greenish. The head was too wide, the mouth a lipless gash that stretched nearly the width of its skull. It made no sound. That was what struck me most, the absolute silence of its movement. Even the mud it displaced fell back into place without the wet slap I expected. The creature covered ground with a paddling motion, front appendages that were neither hands nor paws but something in between, digits webbed and splayed, each tipped with what looked like dark nails or maybe small hooves. Garrett set down his brush very carefully. The motion was deliberate, controlled, and when he spoke his voice was so quiet I almost missed it over the truck's idling engine. Don't move sudden, don't meet its eyes. But I already had. I'd locked onto that amber gaze and found something looking back that felt ancient and cold and completely alien to anything I understood about Nevada wildlife. Coyotes I'd seen, rattlesnakes plenty, even a mountain lion once from a safe distance. This was nothing that belonged in any taxonomy I knew. It reached the rear wheel of Garrett's truck and stopped. Then, with movements that seemed to unfold rather than execute, it rose up. Not standing exactly, its body remained horizontal, but lifting its front portion like a dog sitting back on its haunches. The appendages came up, those webbed digits gripping the tire's edge, testing it, feeling the weight. The membrane between its fingers caught the light, and I could see veins or arteries branching through, dark against the translucence. The smell intensified. That underwater rot, but also something sharper, almost chemical. My eyes watered and my throat tried to close, and somewhere in my hindbrain, the part that still remembered when humans weren't apex predators, alarm bells were screaming. Garrett moved. Slow, casual, like he was just adjusting his stance. His hand went to the cab of his truck and came back with a rifle I hadn't known was there. He didn't aim it at the creature, just raised the barrel skyward and fired twice in quick succession. The reports cracked across the empty land, echoing off the mountains I couldn't see but knew were there. The thing dropped. Instantly, completely, gone from the tire to the mud in a motion my eyes couldn't follow. By the time I thought to look for where it had been, there was only disturbed earth and a trail of displacement leading back toward the lake. And the mud was moving, not flowing or settling, but rhythmically rising and falling, like something underneath was breathing. We stood there, Garrett and I, frozen in our separate recognitions of what we'd seen. The epoxy was still curing on the housing between us, mundane and necessary and suddenly absurd. After a long moment, Garrett lowered the rifle and said in that same quiet voice, "Best we finish up." We did. Neither of us spoke again until the work was done and we were packing tools. And even then, Garrett only said, "Don't come out here at night anymore. Not to this trough." Then he added, softer, almost to himself, "Things that breathe water and earth, you don't mess with them. They were here first and they'll be here after." I wanted to ask what he meant, what he knew, what the hell I'd just seen. But his face had closed like a door, and I understood somehow that asking would be worse than not knowing. So I nodded, loaded my truck, and drove back to the trailer I was renting in Hawthorne, with my hands shaking on the wheel. That should have been the end of it. A strange encounter, the kind of story you tell yourself you'll eventually share but never quite do because you know how it sounds. Desert hallucination, heat exhaustion despite the cool night. Some kind of large toad or salamander species I wasn't familiar with. Perspective and shadow and fear transforming it into something worse. But 3 days later, I found the prints. I'd gone out to move my truck, planning to rotate the tires, basic maintenance. And there on the concrete pad where I parked, clear as day in the morning light, were marks. 5 of them, arranged in a pattern that made my stomach drop. They weren't quite handprints, but they weren't animal tracks either. The shape was wrong, compressed at the center with those radiating digits, and the orientation, they faced backward. Knuckles where palms should be, the pressure points all inverted, like something that walked on the backs of its hands. The concrete was old, cracked, but these impressions were fresh, deep enough that whatever made them had been heavy, or had pressed down with purpose. I knelt beside them, not touching, just looking, and noticed they were damp. Not wet with water, but with something thicker. Something that left a faint residue that caught the light like oil. I looked around. My trailer sat alone on a quarter-acre lot, sage and scrub brush on 3 sides. The nearest neighbor a quarter-mile down the road. Nothing but open space and heat shimmer and that constant Nevada wind that never quite died. No lakes nearby, no water source except my own well. No reason for anything amphibious to be here, 40 miles from where I'd seen it. Except it had been. I knew that with the same certainty I knew my own name. The thing from the trough had followed me home, or tracked me, or somehow knew where I lived. It had come in the night. Last night, the night before, and stood beside my truck, touching it the way it had touched Garrett's. Measuring, assessing, claiming. I should have called someone. Sheriff maybe, or animal control, or Garrett himself. But what would I say? And more than that, some instinct told me that involving authorities would only make it worse, would bring attention to something that preferred to remain unacknowledged. Instead, I got a hose and washed away the prints. Scrubbed the concrete until my arms ached and the residue was gone, and I could almost convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. The smell lingered, though, that underwater rot smell, and I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, scanning the brush line, watching the shadows that didn't quite move right in the peripheral. Nights became difficult. I'd wake at 3, 4 in the morning, convinced I'd heard something outside. Not footsteps exactly, too liquid for that, but displacement. The sound of something heavy moving through space it had no business occupying. I'd lie there in the dark, afraid to look out the window, afraid not to, while my heart hammered and my skin prickled with the certainty of being watched. During the day, I'd tell myself I was being ridiculous, paranoid. That stress and isolation were making me see patterns where none existed, transform ordinary night sounds into evidence of stalking. But then I'd find small things out of place. The water bowl I kept outside for strays, bone dry when I knew I'd filled it. Mud smears on my truck's undercarriage that looked almost like handprints. A smell near my door that made me gag. I started keeping the lights on at night. All of them, interior and exterior, my electrical bill be damned. Light meant safety, meant visibility, meant nothing could approach without being seen. Except light also meant I could see out my windows, and sometimes, on the very edge of where the porch light died, I'd catch movement. Something low to the ground, watching, waiting. Garrett called once, asked how I was settling in. I almost told him, came so close to spilling everything, but something in his tone stopped me. He sounded tired, older than his 70-odd years, and when I asked if he'd had any more trouble with the trough, he just said he'd moved it to the south pasture, away from the lake, and left it at that. The silence that followed carried weight. An understanding that some subjects were better left alone, I've started wondering if this is how it happens. Not movie monster attacks or dramatic confrontations, but a slow erosion of certainty. You see something that shouldn't exist, and afterward, nothing feels solid anymore. The rules you thought governed reality start seeming more like suggestions, easily bent by things that know different laws. Last night I woke to find my front door open, just slightly, maybe 3 inches, enough for the desert cold to seep in and raise goosebumps on my arms. I don't remember leaving it unlocked, don't remember opening it, but memory feels slippery lately, unreliable. I got up, crossed the trailer in my bare feet, and as I reached to close it, I looked down. There in the doorway, half in and half out of my home, was a print. Single, fresh, pressed into the threshold with enough force to leave an impression in the metal. The same backward orientation, those webbed digits splayed, and this time I could see the faint texture of the skin that made it. Pebbled, rough, nothing like human, nothing like anything I want to understand. I closed the door, locked it, deadbolted it, shoved a chair under the knob. Then I sat on my couch with all the lights blazing and waited for dawn, while outside, so faint I might have imagined it, came the sound of mud breathing. I'm still here, still in Nevada, still in this trailer, still doing day work for ranchers who need an extra hand. People ask sometimes if I like it here, if I'll stay. I tell them I don't know yet, that I'm taking it one day at a time. What I don't tell them is that I'm afraid to leave. Afraid that moving would be an admission, a confirmation that something is hunting me. Afraid that wherever I went I'd find prints on my doorstep, smell that rotting water smell. Wake to doors I know I locked standing open. Sometimes I drive out toward Walker Lake, though I never get close. I'll park on a ridge and look out over that ancient, shrinking body of water and wonder what lives in the margins, in the mud and marsh where water meets land and things that shouldn't exist find purchase. I wonder if Garrett knows more than he let on, if there are others who've seen it, if this is just how life works in places too empty for denial. You learn to coexist with the impossible because you have no other choice. The desert doesn't sleep. I understand that now. It watches with amber eyes and moves with amphibian patience and tests the weight of your life with webbed fingers. It knows you're temporary, that everything you build on its surface will eventually sink back into the alkaline mud, that one day you'll stop running and it will still be there, breathing beneath, waiting to reclaim what you borrowed. I just hope I'm gone before it decides to collect. Story 6. Don't stay anywhere without wooden shutters anymore. Not since the Blue Ridge cabin. Not since I heard my own voice calling from the other side of a locked door. The trip was Pritchard's idea. 3 days of fly fishing in October, when the streams ran cold and clear through the Appalachian foothills. Just the 3 of us. Pritchard, Voss, and me. We'd been doing these autumn escapes for years, ever since college, back when the world felt smaller and safer. The cabin we'd rented sat 2 miles from the nearest paved road, tucked into a hollow where the pines grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon, the truck bouncing over ruts and exposed roots until the structure emerged from the trees like something half forgotten. It was older than the listing photo suggested. Rough-hewn logs gone silver with age, a stone chimney leaning slightly to the left, windows that reflected the forest in warped, uneven panes. The porch sagged in the middle. Inside, everything smelled of mildew and old cedar, with undertones of something else I couldn't quite place. Something organic and faintly sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. That first day passed unremarkably. We unpacked, argued good-naturedly about who got which bunk, and spent the afternoon waist-deep in the stream that cut through the property. The water was so cold it made my teeth ache. Pritchard caught 4 brookies. Voss caught nothing but complained endlessly about his gear. I caught 2 and spent most of my time watching the way light filtered through the canopy, turning everything green and gold and somehow alien. The woods were quiet. Too quiet, Voss joked that evening as we cooked the fish over the wood stove, but he was right, though I didn't want to acknowledge it. No birds. No rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the constant whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional creak of the cabin settling around us. The second day, we decided to explore the ridge trail that wound up behind the property. The owner had mentioned it, a 2-hour loop that offered views of the valley below. We set out mid-morning, Pritchard leading with his characteristic confidence, Voss trailing behind with a cigarette dangling from his lips, me in the middle with a backpack full of water and trail mix we'd never eat. The ascent was steeper than expected. The trail, if it could be called that, was barely more than a deer path choked with mountain laurel and fallen logs. The higher we climbed, the thicker the pines grew, their trunks pressing closer together until we had to move single file. The silence followed us. No birdsong, no insects, just our breathing and the crunch of dead needles beneath our boots. Halfway up, Voss stopped to light another cigarette and squinted into the trees to our left. He didn't say anything, but I followed his gaze. There was nothing there, just more pines, their bark black with age, their branches creating a latticework of shadows. But something about the space between those trees felt wrong. Not empty, exactly. More like something had just stepped out of sight. We kept moving. The view from the ridge was worth it, or so we told ourselves. The valley spread out below in waves of crimson and orange, the autumn colors so vivid they looked artificial. We ate our sandwiches and took photos and tried to ignore the way the wind kept shifting direction, bringing with it that same too-sweet smell from the cabin. Voss noticed it too. I saw his nose wrinkle, saw the way his eyes tracked the tree line. We started back down as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The temperature dropped fast in the mountains. By the time we were halfway down the trail, our breath was visible, small ghosts dissipating in the dimming light. The pines seemed darker now, their shadows longer and more angular. Pritchard picked up the pace. That's when we saw them. 2 points of light, yellowish amber, hovering at chest height maybe 30 yards into the trees. They didn't move, didn't blink, just hung there in the gloom between the trunks, steady and unnatural. We all stopped walking. Pritchard fumbled for his phone, activating the flashlight. The beam lanced through the forest, and for a heartbeat, maybe two, I saw what held those lights. The proportions were wrong, too tall, too narrow, limbs that bent at angles that made my stomach clench. When Pritchard's light hit it full on, the thing didn't recoil or flee like a deer would. It crouched, the legs bent backward, knees reversing, and then it was gone. Not running exactly, more like it folded itself into the shadows, there one moment and absent the next. The only sound was a soft rustling, like fabric dragging across bark. None of us spoke. We walked the rest of the way to the cabin in silence, glancing back every few steps, hands white-knuckled on our phones. The smell followed us down the mountain, that sweet, rotting fruit smell that now made me think of decay, barely hidden under perfume. Back at the cabin, we went through the motions of normalcy, built a fire, opened beers, made jokes about mountain lions and deer, and the tricks low light can play on tired eyes. But the jokes felt hollow, and we kept drifting toward the windows, peering out at the darkening forest. Pritchard checked the locks 3 times. Voss suggested we drive back to town, stay in a motel, come back for our stuff in daylight. Pritchard called him paranoid. I said nothing, just watched the glass reflect our lamplight and wondered what was watching back. We decided to stay. We were grown men after all, rational, educated. We'd all seen stranger things while hiking, probably just a bear or a trick of perspective. The mind fills in patterns where there are none. We knew this. We repeated it like a mantra. By 11, we'd turned in. Pritchard took the main bedroom. Voss and I claimed the bunks in the loft. I lay there staring at the rough ceiling boards, listening to the cabin expand and contract in the cooling air. Every sound felt amplified. The drip of the faucet, the tick of settling wood, Voss's restless shifting in the bunk below. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like slow breathing. I didn't think I'd sleep, but I must have, because I woke to knocking. 3 sharp raps on the front door, then silence, then 3 more. I checked my phone, 12:47 a.m. In the bunk below, Voss was sitting up. I could tell by the creak of the frame. From downstairs, no sound from Pritchard's room. The knocking came again, then a voice. Pritchard's voice, slightly muffled by the door but unmistakable. "Hey, open up. I went out to piss and forgot my key." I started to move, my feet searching for the ladder, but Voss's hand shot up and grabbed my ankle. His fingers were cold, and his grip was iron. He put one finger to his lips and pointed toward Pritchard's door, which I could just see from my angle. It was closed, no light underneath. The voice came again, more insistent now. "Come on, it's freezing out here. Just open the door." It sounded exactly like Pritchard. The same slight gravel in his voice, the same cadence and inflection. But Pritchard was in his room. Had to be. We'd all checked the locks together. No one had left. I climbed down as quietly as I could. Voss and I moved to the railing, looking down at the front door. In the darkness, we could just make out its outline. The knocking resumed, harder now, more urgent. "Guys, this isn't funny. I'm serious, let me in." Voss cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Pritchard, that you?" Silence. Then from behind Pritchard's bedroom door directly below us, his actual voice, thick with sleep and confusion. "What?" "I'm right here." "What's going on?" The knocking stopped. For maybe 10 seconds there was absolute quiet. No wind, no settling wood, nothing. Then the voice outside spoke again, and my blood turned to ice water. It was my voice. My exact voice, down to the slight rasp I get when I'm tired. "Voss, it's me. I went out the back door to check something. Let me in." But I was standing right there, next to Voss, his face pale in the darkness. Pritchard's door swung open and he stood there in boxers and a t-shirt, looking up at us with wide eyes. The thing outside started knocking again, this time moving along the front of the cabin, from the door toward the window. We could track its progress by sound, knuckles on wood, then knuckles on glass. My voice kept calling, repeating variations of the same plea. "Let me in. It's cold. I'm locked out. Why won't you open the door?" Pritchard grabbed his phone, hands shaking so badly he could barely activate it. No signal. Of course no signal. We were too deep in the hollow. He moved toward the front door, and we both hissed at him to stop, but he shook his head and pressed his eye to the peephole. He jerked back immediately, stumbling over his own feet. When he looked at us, his face had gone the color of old paper. "Nothing," he whispered. "There's nothing there, but I can hear it right on the other side." The knocking intensified, spreading around the cabin now. Front door, side window, back door, another window. It was moving too fast. No person could cover that distance so quickly. And the voices cycled through all 3 of us, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes mimicking conversations we'd had that very day. Then the radio turned on, the old battery-powered AM/FM we'd found in a drawer and used earlier to get a weather report. It sat on the kitchen counter, and now it crackled to life with a burst of static. But instead of a station, we heard ourselves. My voice from the afternoon. "Think we should turn back?" Voss's reply. "Nah, view's supposed to be incredible." Pritchard. "Besides, we're halfway there." The conversation from the ridge replayed perfectly, every inflection and pause an ambient sound. The crunch of our footsteps on the trail, the wind, even Voss's lighter clicking as he'd lit his cigarette. We stood frozen as it played on, moving through our dinner conversation, our jokes about Voss's fishing luck, my complaint about a blister on my heel. All of it captured somehow, stored somewhere, now being played back to us in the dead of night while something circled the cabin, wearing our voices like masks. Pritchard lunged forward and ripped the batteries out of the radio. The playback stopped mid-sentence. The knocking stopped too. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, thick and expectant. like the cabin was holding its breath. We pulled all the curtains, checked every lock twice, dragged furniture against the doors. Then we sat together in the main room, lights blazing, and waited for dawn. None of us spoke. What was there to say? That we'd all seen the same thing, heard the same thing, that something in these woods could steal voices and faces and play them back like recordings. Around 3 a.m., Voss got up to use the bathroom. On his way back, he stopped at the front window, the one that looked out toward the driveway. He stood there for a long moment, then gestured for us to come look. In the dirt outside, illuminated by the porch light Pritchard had left burning, were footprints. Deep ones, deeper than any human footfall should leave. They came from the tree line, approached the window where Voss stood, and then simply stopped, not turned around, not spread apart as if something had jumped, just ended, as if whatever made them had ceased to exist mid-stride. Past those prints, at the edge of the light's reach, I thought I saw those amber points again. But when I blinked, they were gone, if they'd been there at all. We left at first light, not even bothering to pack properly, just threw everything in bags and drove out as fast as the rutted track would allow. None of us looked back. At the rental office in town, I handed over the keys and cited a family emergency. The woman behind the counter took them without question, but something in her expression suggested she'd heard similar stories before. We've never talked about it since. Not really. Voss moved to Colorado 6 months later. Pritchard's calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. I still go hiking, still travel, still camp, but never again without checking the windows first. Never anywhere without solid wooden shutters that can be barred from the inside. Because sometimes, late at night in my apartment in the city, I'll hear my phone's voice assistant activate without being triggered, and it will play back things I said hours before, conversations I've had, complaints I've muttered, jokes I've made to myself. Just little snippets, out of context, at random moments. And I wonder if we really left it behind in those Blue Ridge pines, or if some part of it followed us home, patient and watchful, collecting our words and voices and storing them away for reasons I can't begin to understand. The shutters help me sleep, though. They're solid oak, 3 inches thick, with an iron bar that slots across them from the inside. When they're closed, I can almost convince myself that nothing can get in, almost believe that the reflection I sometimes glimpse in the glass, the one that moves just slightly wrong, that bends at angles that shouldn't be possible, is just a trick of the light. Almost. But I keep the shutters closed anyway. Story 7. The thing about feeding strays is that you never really own them. You're just another stop on their nightly circuit, a reliable source of kibble between whatever else they hunt or scavenge in the sprawling Phoenix suburbs. My roommate and I had been leaving food out for the calico for 3 years, maybe 4. She had a distinctive pattern, a splash of orange over her left eye, black over the right, like someone had painted her face in asymmetrical halves. We never named her. Naming things implies possession, and she wasn't ours to possess. The night it happened, I'd been sorting through boxes in the garage. My ex had finally asked for her things back, which meant confronting 3 years of accumulated memory in cardboard form. Photos mostly. Some letters. A few trinkets that had seemed meaningful once. My roommate suggested burning them in the fire pit out back, said it might be cathartic. He was probably right, though I suspect he just wanted an excuse to use the outdoor fireplace he'd insisted on building last summer. The desert air that October evening carried a peculiar quality, dry and cool, with an undercurrent of something electric. Monsoon season had ended weeks ago, but the atmosphere still felt charged, expectant. We dragged the metal chairs onto the patio, and I fed photographs into the flames one by one, watching faces curl and blacken. My roommate had gone inside to grab more beer, leaving me alone with the fire and the smell of burning glossy paper, which is somehow worse than you'd imagine, chemical and sweet, with an acrid edge that coated the back of my throat. That's when I heard it. 3 distinct knocks on the back door, measured, deliberate. Nothing like the random thump of a branch in the wind or an animal brushing against wood. These were knocks with intention behind them. I turned, and through the glass panel beside the door, I could see her, the calico, sitting perfectly upright on the concrete step, one paw raised as if she'd just finished knocking. Which was absurd, obviously. Cats don't knock. But there she was, backlit by the motion sensor light, and something about her posture made my stomach clench. I approached slowly, beer bottle still in hand, and that's when I noticed. The orange splash should have been over her left eye. It was over her right. The black pattern reversed, like looking at her reflection instead of her actual face. I stopped 3 feet from the door, and it tilted its head. Not the quick bird-like movement cats usually make. This was slow, deliberate, mechanical almost. The exact angle I tilt my head when I'm trying to understand something confusing. I'd seen myself do it in mirrors my whole life. My mother had teased me about it since childhood. 43 degrees to the left, chin slightly tucked. The thing that looked like our cat mimicked that gesture perfectly. Its eyes were wrong too. Cat's eyes in the dark show that reflective shine, that alien gleam. These eyes were different, deep and dark and almost matte, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. And the pupils. Too round, too human. They tracked my face with an intelligence that felt observational, analytical. The way you'd study a specimen. The way I'd been studying those photographs before feeding them to the flames. I wanted to step back, to call for my roommate, but my throat had gone dry. The thing, because I couldn't think of it as her anymore, not with that reversed face, continued to stare. It didn't blink. Cats blink. This thing just watched with those bottomless eyes, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd drawn breath. The words came out without conscious thought, some desperate attempt to reclaim normalcy through routine. Come back tomorrow. Our usual phrase when the calico showed up at the wrong time, when we'd already put the food out or were about to leave. Come back tomorrow. Simple, dismissive, safe. The thing took 2 steps backward. Not turning, not shifting position. Just backward, front paws lifting and placing in perfect reverse, like I was watching footage played in rewind. Its eyes never left mine. 2 steps, and then it was at the edge of the patio, where my roommate's grape arbor cast shadows thick enough to hide anything. The motion sensor light flickered once, just once, and it was gone, not running away into the darkness, just gone, as if those shadows had inhaled it. My roommate found me standing at the door, bottle forgotten on the floor where I'd dropped it, amber liquid spreading across tile. He asked if I was okay, and I told him I'd seen a coyote. Not the cat. Not the thing with her reversed face and human eyes. A coyote. Something that made sense in the Phoenix suburbs, where desert and development blurred together. I didn't sleep that night. Lay in bed listening to every sound. The air conditioning cycling on and off. The house settling. The distant highway traffic. And underneath it all, I strained to hear footsteps on the patio. The soft pad of paws, or worse, the measured knock 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 of something that shouldn't know how to knock. The next morning, she appeared. The real one. Orange splash over the left eye, black over the right, patterns exactly as they'd always been. She wound between my legs as I refilled her bowl, purring that rumbling motor sound, and I wanted to feel relieved. Instead, I found myself studying her face, looking for inconsistencies, for any sign that the patterns might shift when I wasn't watching. Her eyes were normal, that clear amber with elliptical pupils, catching the morning light and throwing it back green gold. She blinked at me slowly, the feline gesture of trust, and something in my chest unknotted slightly, but only slightly. I moved her feeding station that afternoon, no longer by the back door where she'd always eaten. Now I put the bowls on the other side of the chain-link fence that separated our yard from the undeveloped lot behind us. The calico seemed confused at first, pacing the fence line, but she adapted. Animals always do. My roommate asked why I'd moved things, and I told him I'd seen rats getting into the food. Another lie. They were coming easier now. I also installed a motion sensor light aimed at the back door, bright enough to flood the entire patio in harsh white LED. My roommate joked about our yard looking like a prison. I told him it was for security. He didn't push it. 3 nights later, I woke to the light blazing outside my window. 2:15 in the morning, according to my phone. I lay there, heart hammering, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or a stray dog. Telling myself a lot of things as I forced my legs out of bed and walked to the window that overlooked the patio. Nothing. The concrete was empty, the door undisturbed, but the light was on, which meant something had triggered the sensor. I watched for 10 minutes, 15, until the light cycled off on its timer. Then I watched the darkness where the arbor crouched, thick with shadow. I thought I saw movement there, something shifting at the boundary between light and dark, but I couldn't be certain. Might have been the wind, might have been my eyes inventing shapes in the nothing. I started checking on the real cat obsessively. Every morning and evening when she came to the fence for food, I'd study her. The pattern stayed correct, left eye orange, right eye black. But sometimes when the light hit her a certain way, I'd feel that crawling doubt. Sometimes she'd tilt her head, and I'd wonder if the angle was just slightly wrong, just off enough to make my skin prickle. My roommate noticed I wasn't sleeping well, asked if I wanted to talk about the breakup, if burning the photos had dredged up things better left buried. I appreciated his concern, but how could I explain? How could I tell him that every time I closed my eyes, I saw that reversed face, those absorbing eyes, the mechanical tilt of recognition? How could I describe the certainty I felt that something had been watching me burn those photographs, had seen me destroying connections to the past and had decided to, what? Show itself? Mock me? Replace something? I researched mirror images obsessively, learned that some cultures believe mirrors can trap souls, create doorways, double reality in dangerous ways. Learned about doppelgangers and fetch creatures and shadow selves. None of it helped. All of it made things worse. The rational part of my brain tried to assert itself. I'd been drinking. I was emotionally compromised from the breakup. The smoke from burning photographs, especially old ones with chemical treatments, could cause mild hallucinations. The pattern on a calico cat isn't perfectly symmetrical anyway. I might have just been turned around, confused about which side was which. These explanations made sense. They fit with reality as I understood it. But I kept the light on. Kept the food on the other side of the fence. Started coming home before dark. Not because I had a reason, but because the idea of arriving after sunset, of walking from my car to the back door in the dark, made my hands shake. The real cat, I still thought of her as real, needed to think of her as real, started acting strange. She'd approach the fence for food, then stop several feet away, hackles raised, staring past me toward the house, toward the arbor. Once, she hissed at nothing I could see, then fled into the desert scrub. Didn't come back for 2 days. When she did return, she wouldn't eat unless I stayed there, standing guard, and even then she kept looking over her shoulder. Animals know things. That's what they say, isn't it? Animals sense things humans miss. I wanted to dismiss it as her picking up on my anxiety, reflecting my own fear back at me. But the way she watched that arbor, the way her ears would flatten when shadows moved a certain way, she was afraid of something specific. I thought about cutting down the arbor. My roommate loved that thing, had planted the vines himself, tended them carefully through the brutal summer heat. But those shadows it cast at night, thick and fluid and somehow wrong, made my teeth ache. I'd stand at the window with all the lights on inside, making the glass into a mirror, and I'd watch those shadows, trying to catch movement, trying to prove to myself that nothing was there. But mirrors lie, don't they? Or maybe they tell a truth that's reversed, inverted, the world seen from the wrong side. Maybe that's worse than lying. I stopped going out at night entirely. Stopped checking the food bowls after sunset. My roommate started handling the back patio, taking out trash, bringing in mail from the box by the rear gate. He thought I was depressed, grieving the relationship. Let him think that. Better than the alternative. Last week the calico stopped coming, 3 days, 4 days, 5. The food I left went untouched except by ants and the occasional bird. My roommate suggested she'd moved on, found a better territory. Said 3 years was a good run for a stray. But I knew something had changed. On the 6th night, I heard it again. 3 knocks. Measured, deliberate. I was alone in the house, my roommate visiting family out of state. The motion sensor light blazed on, flooding the patio in white glare. I didn't go to the door. Instead, I turned off every light in the house, plunging myself into darkness. Made the windows into true mirrors, reflecting the lit patio back at itself. And there, in that reversed reflection, I could see it sitting on the step. Orange splash over the left eye in the mirror, which meant it was actually on the right. Black where black shouldn't be. Those dark, human eyes fixed on my window, on where I stood hidden in shadow. It tilted its head 43 degrees, chin slightly tucked. My gesture, my habit. And then it raised one paw and knocked again. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed through the empty house. I've been keeping all the lights on since then, inside, outside, every fixture burning, every fixture. The electric bill will be astronomical. My roommate returns tomorrow, and I don't know what I'm going to tell him. Don't know how to explain why I've pushed furniture against the back door, why I've stopped looking at mirrors, why I check the cat's food from the front window with binoculars rather than going outside. The thing is, I've been thinking about those photographs I burned, all those faces, all those moments dissolved into ash and smoke. Energy released into the air, matter transformed but not destroyed. My ex used to say I had a habit of erasing things when they became inconvenient, of pretending problems didn't exist if I looked away long enough. Maybe she was right. Maybe something noticed. Maybe something that already lived in reversal, in reflection, in the wrong side of things, saw an opportunity in all that erasure, saw a person who didn't look too closely, who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Or maybe I'm losing my mind. Maybe the stress of the breakup, the isolation of the pandemic years, the endless phoenix heat that bakes thoughts into strange shapes. Maybe it all just broke something in my brain. Maybe there's no monster at my door, no doppelganger cat, no thing watching from the shadows. Maybe there's just me, alone in a suburban house, staring at lights and jumping at sounds and losing the thread of what's real. I don't know which possibility scares me more. The food bowl is still on the other side of the fence. I fill it every morning from the front of the house, walking around the block rather than through the back gate. The motion sensor light stays on all night now. I disabled the timer. And sometimes, in the hours before dawn when exhaustion finally drags me under, I dream about mirrors, about standing between 2 mirrors, seeing myself reflected infinite times in both directions, and noticing that in one of those reflections, just one, somewhere in that endless regression, something is slightly wrong. A pattern reversed. An eye that shouldn't be there. A tilt of the head that I never made. I always wake before I can figure out which reflection is wrong. The real one, or all the others. The lights stay on. The door stays barred. And I keep watching the shadows under that arbor, waiting for the moment when I'll have to decide. Am I the one observing, or the one being observed? Am I feeding a stray cat out of kindness, or am I the one being fed upon? My certainties about reality consumed bite by bite until nothing remains but doubt? Tomorrow my roommate comes back. Tomorrow I'll have to pretend everything is normal. Tomorrow I'll have to be the version of myself that makes sense, that fits with consensus reality. But tonight, alone in this house of burning lights, I understand something I didn't before. The thing about feeding strays is that you never really know what you're feeding. You put out food and walk away, assuming the transaction is simple, transactional, safe. You forget that predators eat too. And the patient ones, the really patient ones, they'll wait years if necessary, learning your patterns, memorizing your gestures, watching until they understand exactly how you move through the world, exactly how you tilt your head when confronted with something you don't understand. And then, when you're vulnerable, when you're alone and burning bridges to your past, they'll knock 3 times, deliberate, measured, and they'll wait to see if you'll answer. I haven't answered. Not yet. But the night is long, and the knocking always comes back. And one of these times, I'm afraid I'll forget which side of the door I'm supposed to be on. Story 8. The fog came in thick that morning, the kind that turns the world into something else entirely. I'd grown up on that ranch in the backcountry of Montana, where the nearest neighbor was 12 miles down a dirt road that turned to soup every spring, and I thought I knew every sound the land could make. The creak of lodgepole pines in wind, the crack of ice on the creek, the way elk bugle carries across a valley at dawn. But that morning I heard something new. It started as metal scraping metal, rhythmic and wrong, coming from somewhere beyond the barn. The horses in the paddock had their ears pinned back, heads high, nostrils flared. They weren't looking at me. They were looking past the tree line toward the high meadow, the one ringed by dense forest where the grass grew tall and the morning light came late. I should have stayed by the barn, should have checked the fence posts, or convinced myself it was just an old gate swinging loose. But sound has a way of pulling you, especially when it doesn't belong. I followed it through the pine stand where the ground stays soft with needles, where the light filters green even at midday. The fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it had thickened, turning the trees into suggestions of themselves, gray shapes that might have been there or might have been something else. The meadow opened up sudden, the way clearings do in dense forest, and the sound stopped. 3 shapes stood in the clearing, equidistant from each other like points on a triangle. At first, my brain tried to make them into deer, big mule deer maybe, or elk that had shed their velvet wrong. But deer don't stand that still, don't hold their heads at that angle, tilted just slightly as if listening to something beneath the ground. And deer don't have skin pulled that tight across their ribs, stretched taut like canvas on a frame, so you can count each bone beneath. Their antlers were wrong. Too many points, branching in directions that didn't follow any pattern I recognized. The velvet hung from them in long strips, not shedding clean the way it should, but peeling like birch bark, like something rotting while still attached. One of them shifted its weight, and that's when I heard the sound again. Not metal on metal, but bone on bone, the click and scrape of joints moving in ways joints shouldn't move. They were fighting, I realized, but not touching, circling each other in that frozen triangle, jaws working open and closed, teeth clicking together in what might have been threat displays, or might have been something else entirely. Communication, maybe, or feeding on something I couldn't see. The one nearest to me turned its head, and I felt my stomach drop in a way it never had before, not even when I'd been thrown from a green colt or found myself face to face with a mountain lion on a narrow trail. Its eyes were filmed over, milky white, but somehow I knew it could see me. Not the way animals see, identifying threats and food and passage. It saw me, the way you feel watched through a window at night, the way you know someone's reading the back of your neck in a crowded room. Behind me I heard the fence break, not the neat pop of a wire snapping or the groan of an old post giving way, but the violent crack of wood splitting, of multiple boards going at once under sustained pressure. My 3 horses, the bay mare, the gray gelding, and the young sorrel I'd been training, came through the tree line at a gallop. They weren't running from something. They were running to something, to me, and they didn't slow down. The mare reached me first, shouldering past me hard enough that I stumbled. But she didn't barrel through. None of them did. They arranged themselves between me and those things in the meadow, forming a living wall of horseflesh, their bodies pressed close, breath coming hard through flared nostrils. The sorrel, who still spooked at plastic bags and his own shadow, stood rock steady, ears flat against his skull. I couldn't see past them, couldn't see through the gaps between their bodies. They'd positioned themselves too perfectly, overlapping like scales, like they'd rehearsed it. For a moment, and I remember this with absolute clarity, I had the distinct impression they were shielding me not just from sight, but from being seen, as if those things in the meadow tracked not by movement or scent, but by attention, by the act of being perceived. We stood like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The horses didn't shift, didn't lower their heads or stamp or do any of the normal things nervous horses do. They held position like trained cavalry mounts, like they understood something I didn't. The fog began to thin, and with it, the feeling of being underwater faded. Sound returned. Normal sound. A raven calling from the ridgeline. Wind moving through the pines with that ocean rush it makes in the high country. The horses' breathing began to slow, ears swiveling forward, muscles loosening beneath their coats. When they finally shifted apart, letting me see the meadow again, it was empty. But the ground where those things had stood was dark. Not with shadow, because the sun hadn't reached that spot yet. Dark with blood that had dried to black, deer blood from the smell of it, though I saw no body. Just 3 circles of it, each about 6 feet across, soaked into the grass and soil, and scattered throughout the clearing, tufts of hair, not deer hair, horsehair, bay and gray and sorrel, torn out in clumps like something had pulled it free. I walked the meadow's edge, following the tree line, and found it 20 feet up in a lodgepole pine, a hank of gray horsehair, caught in a branch that would have required the gelding to rear straight up, to stretch higher than any horse should reach. But the bark beneath showed no scratches, no marks from hooves. The hair was just there, placed high like a marker or a warning. The horses followed me back to the ranch that day, close enough that I could feel their breath on my shoulders. I didn't unsaddle them, didn't let them into the paddock. I kept them near the house within sight, and they didn't object. They grazed within a tight circle, never more than a few yards from each other, lifting their heads frequently to stare toward the meadow. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the ranch, the wind in the eaves, the creek running behind the barn, the distant yip of coyotes, and underneath it all, faint but present, that metallic scraping sound. Not from the meadow this time, but closer, from the tree line just beyond the house, where the forest pressed in dark and the moonlight didn't reach. I told myself it was branches rubbing together, old equipment settling, the normal sounds of a property this remote, this close to wilderness. But I knew what branches sounded like, knew every legitimate noise this place could make. In the morning, I found tracks in the soft earth near the barn, deep gouges, like something with too many joints had dragged itself through. The horses stood in a tight cluster at the far end of the paddock, as far from those marks as they could get without breaking fence again. The bay mare had a new wound on her shoulder, a long scrape that looked like something had raked across her without quite breaking skin. When I tried to examine it, she flinched away, trembling. I stopped riding alone after that, kept the horses close, always at least 2 of them saddled and ready. The ranch hands, the seasonal workers who came up for haying and fence repair, started commenting on how the horses wouldn't settle, how they seemed nervous in ways that range horses shouldn't be, constantly alert, constantly watching the tree line. One of them, an older man who'd worked ranches his whole life, asked me straight out what had them spooked. I told him I didn't know, which was both true and a lie. The truth was I didn't know what they'd seen. What I'd seen, in daylight, with distance and time between me and that morning, my memory started feeling less reliable. Had those things really been there? Had they looked the way I remembered? Or had the fog and my own fear distorted them into something they weren't? Maybe they'd been ordinary deer, sick or injured, and my isolated brain had filled in the rest. Maybe the horses had broken fence for normal horse reasons. A predator nearby, a sudden noise, and I'd constructed meaning from coincidence. But then I'd go up to the meadow, and the blood would still be there. Fainter now, washed by rain and overgrown by new grass, but visible if you knew where to look. 3 dark circles, where nothing would grow quite right. And high in that lodgepole pine, the gray hair still hung, weathering but present, too high for any rational explanation. The scraping sounds continued, not every night, but often enough that I stopped sleeping well. They moved around the property, never in the same place twice, always just beyond clear sight. I'd go out with a flashlight, with a rifle, and find nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no evidence that anything had been there at all. But the horses knew. Every time I heard that sound, they'd cluster together, heads up, bodies tense, staring into the dark. I started avoiding the meadow entirely. taking the long way around through the lower pasture, even though it added an hour to any ride into the back country. The horses didn't object. In fact, they seemed relieved, moving easier once we'd cleared that stretch of forest, their strides lengthening, ears forward instead of constantly swiveling. But the meadow pulled at me. I'd catch myself riding toward it without consciously deciding to, drawn by something I couldn't name. The horses would balk then, planting their feet, refusing to go forward until I turned them back. The sorrel, who'd never been stubborn a day in his life, once reared rather than enter that tree line. I didn't push it, didn't try to force them. Some part of me, the part that had grown up reading sign and trusting animal instinct, knew they were right. 3 weeks after that fog-thick morning, I rode the ridgeline above the ranch just before dawn. The gray gelding picked his way along the narrow trail, sure-footed in the dim light, and we stopped at the overlook where you can see the whole valley spread below. The meadow was visible from there, a pale oval in the dark forest, and as the sun began to rise, burning off the ground fog, I saw them. 3 shapes in the clearing, arranged in that same triangle. Too far away to make out details, but I knew their posture, the angle of their heads, the way they held themselves in space. The gelding went rigid beneath me, every muscle locked. He didn't try to run, didn't bolt or rear. He just stood there, frozen, waiting. And from the meadow, I swear I heard it. That bone-scraping sound carried up on the morning wind, metallic and wrong and perfectly clear. The shapes didn't move, didn't turn to look up at the ridge, but I felt seen anyway, felt recognized in a way that made my skin crawl, made every instinct scream to turn around and ride hard for the barn. The gelding backed up without me asking. 3 careful steps, then 4, removing us from the sight line. He didn't turn around until we were well into the trees, and then he moved faster than he ever had before. Not quite running, but not exactly walking either, putting distance between us and that clearing with the focused urgency of prey escaping a predator. When we reached the barn, I found the bay mare and the sorrel waiting by the gate, though I'd left them in the back pasture. The fence between was intact. No broken boards, no downed wire. They'd simply appeared, standing shoulder to shoulder, watching the trail I'd taken, waiting for us to return. I haven't been up to that overlook since. Haven't taken the trail that leads past the meadow. When I need to check fence line or move cattle, I go the long way, add the extra miles, make the excuses. The ranch hands think I'm getting superstitious in my isolation, developing the kind of quirks that remote living breeds into people. Maybe they're right. But sometimes, on mornings when the fog comes in thick, I wake to find the horses arranged outside my window in a tight semicircle, all facing the tree line. They stand there motionless, barely breathing, until the sun burns the fog away. And on those mornings, I can hear it, faint but distinct, that scraping sound from somewhere in the forest, getting closer, maybe. Or maybe just more comfortable making itself known. Last week I found fresh gouges in the barnwood, too high up to reach without a ladder. Deep parallel scratches that didn't match any tool or animal I know. The horses wouldn't enter the barn for 2 days, and when they finally did, they moved through it fast, ears flat, eyes rolling white at the edges. I should leave, sell the ranch, move somewhere less isolated, less close to whatever wilderness breeds in these mountains. But this land has been in my family for 4 generations. This is home, or was, before that morning. Before I learned that some things don't fit into the categories we make for them, that the world has corners where the rules bend different. Now I just try to keep the horses close. They seem to know something I don't. Something about how to navigate this new reality where the meadow hums with wrong energy and the forest holds shapes that shouldn't exist. They've kept me safe so far, formed their living wall between me and whatever saw me that morning. I cross the meadow mounted now, never on foot, always with at least 2 horses, their bodies solid and real beneath me, their instincts sharper than any logic I can apply. They've been right about everything else. I have to trust they'll be right about this too. About when to run, when to stand still, and when to simply close ranks and wait for the danger to pass. Because it's still out there. In the meadow, in the forest, in the spaces between what I know and what I can't explain. Some mornings I wake up and wonder if I really saw what I think I saw, if my memory has distorted that fog-thick morning into something it never was. But then I see the way the horses react, the way they position themselves, the way they watch the tree line with that patient, knowing attention. They remember, even if I start to doubt, they remember. And every time I catch myself starting down the trail toward that meadow on foot, feel that inexplicable pull toward the clearing, one of them will step into my path, block the way, refuse to let me pass. They know something I'm still trying to understand, about what waits in that ring of trees, about what saw me, marked me, and might still be watching, patient and strange, from somewhere just beyond the fog. And late at night, when the scraping sounds circle the house and the horses stand vigil outside my window, I find myself wondering, are they protecting me from something out there, or are they making sure I don't answer when it calls? I don't know. And that not knowing has become the shape of my life now, riding the edges, avoiding the center, trusting in the wisdom of animals who somehow understand the rules of this new, uncertain world better than I ever will. The gray hair still hangs in that pine tree, 15 feet up where no horse should reach. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I can see it moving. Just that one piece, swaying in a breeze that doesn't touch anything else. A marker, a warning, a promise. I don't go near it anymore. Don't even look in that direction if I can help it. But I know it's there. Just like I know those shapes might still stand in their triangle on fog-thick mornings, arranged in ways that defy the normal geometry of predator and prey, of territory and survival. Some nights I dream about that morning, about the way those things turned their heads, about the specific quality of being seen by something that shouldn't have eyes that work. I wake up shaking, and the horses are always there outside, standing watch, holding the line between me and whatever waits in the meadow. They haven't failed me yet. I just hope they never do, because I think, and this is the thought that keeps me awake most nights, that if they ever stop watching, if they ever break formation and run, I'll finally understand what they've been protecting me from all along. And I'm not sure I want that understanding. Not sure I could survive it. Story 9. The woods behind my uncle's property had always felt wrong to me, even as a kid. Not dangerous exactly. Wrong. Like walking into a room where people had just stopped talking about you. That October afternoon, with my compound bough slung over my shoulder and the Pennsylvania sky turning the color of old bruises, I should have trusted that instinct. I'd been hunting for white-tailed deer in those woods for 3 years, ever since I'd moved back to help Uncle Vernon with the farm after his stroke. The property stretched back maybe 40 acres, mostly oak and hickory, before it met the state forest boundary. Good land, quiet land, the kind of place where you could hear a twig snap from 50 yards away. That's why I noticed the silence first. I'd been tracking a buck for about an hour, moving slow through the beech trees near the old creek bed. The October woods should have been alive with sound, squirrels rustling in the leaf litter, crows cawing, the distant percussion of woodpeckers. But as I crossed into the clearing between two massive beech trees, everything went quiet. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had thrown a switch. The air felt thicker somehow, colder. My breath came out in visible puffs even though it had been almost 60 degrees when I'd started out. I lowered my bow and scanned the tree line, looking for whatever had spooked the wildlife. That's when I saw him. He was floating, not hovering or jumping. Floating. Suspended between those two beech trees about 4 feet off the ground, positioned perfectly in the center of the clearing like some obscene ornament. His body hung limp, chin pressed tight against his chest, arms locked straight at his sides in a way that made my own shoulders ache just looking at it. He wore clothes from another century, a ruffled shirt, the kind you'd see in paintings of colonial gentlemen, stained yellow under the arms. An old-fashioned powdered wig sat crooked on his head. His body was corpulent, soft-looking, like risen dough. But it was his stillness that made my throat close up. He didn't sway or bob. He just hung there, perfectly motionless, as if the air itself had gone solid around him. I stood frozen for what might have been seconds or minutes. Time felt elastic, unreliable. My brain kept trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A mannequin, maybe. Some kind of elaborate Halloween prank strung up in the trees. But there were no wires, no supports, nothing that could explain the impossible geometry of his suspension. I took a step forward. The forest floor crunched under my boot, impossibly loud in that suffocating silence. The figure didn't react, didn't turn his head or shift position. I could see now that his skin had a waxy, translucent quality, like candle wax held up to light. 3 steps would take me to the oak tree where he was floating. 3 steps and I could reach out and touch him, confirm he was real, prove to my hammering heart that this was just some weird art installation, or my eyes playing tricks in the fading light. I didn't take those steps. Instead, I watched as he drifted, and there's no other word for it, behind a thick oak trunk maybe 20 feet ahead. He moved sideways without changing position, that limp hanging posture never shifting, gliding like he was on rails I couldn't see. The trunk was maybe 2 feet wide. I could reach it in 3 or 4 strides. I counted to 10. He should have emerged from the other side by now. I circled around, my bow raised, though I knew instinctively that an arrow wouldn't help me here. The other side of the tree was empty. No figure, no tracks in the soft earth, no disturbance of any kind. The woods were still completely silent. I ran. Not a strategic retreat or a measured withdrawal, a blind, thrashing panic run that sent me crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches. My bow caught on something and I left it behind without a second thought. All I wanted was to get back to the house, to solid walls and electric lights, and the smell of Uncle Vernon's coffee brewing on the stove. When I burst out of the tree line near the barn, gasping and wild-eyed, my friend Dalton was there working on his truck in the driveway. He'd been staying in the converted workshop behind the barn for the past few weeks, helping out with the harvest in exchange for a place to crash while he figured out his next move. He took one look at me and set down his wrench. I told him what I'd seen. In the retelling, it sounded insane, felt insane even coming out of my mouth. But Dalton didn't laugh or tell me I'd been seeing things. He just wiped his hands on his jeans and said, maybe we should check it out together. He'd grown up in these woods too. He understood the way places could get under your skin. We went back as the sun was setting, taking flashlights and Dalton's .22 rifle, which seemed both necessary and completely inadequate. The woods felt different now, darker, denser, like the shadows had multiplied. Our flashlight beams seemed to barely penetrate the gloom. We found the clearing easy enough. I recognized the 2 beech trees, but there was no sign of the figure, no disturbance in the leaves, nothing to suggest anyone, or anything, had been there. Dalton suggested we head back. It was getting dark fast, and neither of us wanted to be in these woods after full nightfall. I agreed immediately, too readily perhaps. The relief of leaving washed over me like warm water. We started back the way we'd come. 20 minutes later, we were standing in front of the same dead pine tree we'd passed on our way in. I recognized the lightning-struck trunk, split down the middle and charred black. My stomach lurched. Dalton said maybe we'd gotten turned around. We adjusted our heading, moved more carefully, keeping the fading light at our backs to stay oriented. 15 minutes of walking brought us back to the dead pine. The third time we found ourselves at that lightning-struck tree. Neither of us said anything. Dalton's jaw was tight, his knuckles white around the rifle stock. The silence of the woods had changed quality. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt full, pregnant with something vast and patient that was watching us circle like mice in a maze. That's when we heard the screaming. It came from everywhere and nowhere, distant but somehow intimate, like it was being piped directly into my skull. The sound rose and fell in waves, echoing as if it was being thrown up from the bottom of a well or down from the top of a cliff. Human screams, but wrong, too regular, too sustained, like someone had recorded a scream and was playing it on a loop. We ran again, crashing through the underbrush without any pretense of maintaining direction. The screaming followed us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always at that same impossible distance. My lungs burned. Branches whipped my face. Dalton was cursing in a continuous stream, his voice high and tight with panic. I nearly fell over them. The globules. They appeared suddenly in my flashlight beam, materializing as if they'd been waiting for us to stumble into them. Translucent spheres about the size of quarters, sitting in a perfect line along the forest floor. They had weight to them. I could see how they pressed down into the soft earth, creating small depressions. They caught the light strangely, refracting it in ways that made my eyes hurt. There must have been 50 of them, leading away through the trees in an unnervingly straight line. They glistened like fresh gelatin, viscous and dense. As I stood there, chest heaving, I realized they formed a path. And more unsettling still, I couldn't remember seeing them on our way into the woods. Dalton moved his flashlight beam along the line of globules. His voice came out strangled when he asked what the hell they were. I had no answer, but when I looked back the way we'd come, I saw only darkness, impenetrable, solid darkness, that seemed to lean toward us with malicious intent. Forward, along the path of globules, I thought I could see a faint lightening of the gloom. We followed them. I don't know how long we walked. The globules continued ahead of us, always just at the edge of our flashlight beams, leading us forward in that impossibly straight line. The screaming had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was worse. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could hear Dalton's ragged breathing beside me, but nothing else. No wind, no insects, no rustle of nocturnal animals, just our footsteps and the wet sound the globules made when we accidentally stepped on one, a thick, gelatinous pop that sent shivers crawling up my spine. When we finally broke through the tree line into Uncle Vernon's backyard, I nearly collapsed with relief. But something was wrong. The workshop where Dalton had been staying was dark, as expected. The house was dark too. Uncle Vernon went to bed at 9 like clockwork, but the barn was lit up like a Christmas tree. Every window blazed with harsh fluorescent light, cutting geometric shapes out of the darkness. We both stopped dead. Neither of us had been near the barn since afternoon. Uncle Vernon couldn't get out there himself anymore, not with his bad hip and the stroke-weakened left side. The lights were on a pull chain system. Someone had to physically be inside to switch them on. Dalton raised the rifle slightly, and we approached the barn together. Our shadows stretched out long and distorted ahead of us, growing and shrinking as we moved between the yard lights. The barn door was closed. When I pulled it open, the hinges screamed in the silence. Inside, everything was exactly as we'd left it. Tools hung on their pegs. The tractor sat dormant in its bay. The overhead fluorescents hummed their normal electrical drone, but the space felt violated somehow, like invisible hands had rearranged everything by millimeters, just enough to trigger some deep instinct that things were not quite right. We searched the barn. Nothing. No one hiding in the hayloft. No footprints in the dust. No sign anyone had been inside at all. I killed the lights, each pull chain releasing with a click that echoed too loudly in the cavernous space, and we retreated to the house. Uncle Vernon was snoring in his room, oblivious. We sat at the kitchen table, not speaking, until the adrenaline finally bled out and left us hollow and shaking. Dalton asked if we should call someone. I nearly laughed. Call who? Tell them what? That we'd gotten lost in woods we knew like our own hands? That we'd followed mysterious gel spheres home? That someone, or something, had helpfully lit our way? I told him we should sleep on it. Things always looked different in daylight. Even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The next morning, I went back to the woods alone while Dalton was still sleeping. I needed to see it in daylight, needed to prove to myself that the previous night had been some combination of panic and darkness and overactive imagination. I found the clearing with the beech trees first. Nothing. Just fallen leaves and morning birdsong. The normalcy of it felt almost mocking. Then I retraced our steps from the night before as best I could remember. I found the path of globules within 15 minutes. Only they weren't globules anymore. They were crusts, dried, cracked, translucent husks that looked exactly like egg whites left to bake in the sun. They still maintained their eerily perfect line through the woods, but now they were desiccated, papery things that crumbled to powder when I touched them. The morning light revealed something I'd missed in the darkness, a faint shimmer around each crust, like an oil slick that made my eyes water if I stared too long. I followed the trail backward, away from Uncle Vernon's property, deeper into the woods. The line continued for maybe a quarter mile before ending abruptly at the base of the same dead pine tree we'd circled around 3 times. The final crust sat directly between the split trunk, marking the spot like a period at the end of an impossible sentence. I stood there for a long time, my shadow falling across that lightning-struck tree. The woods were alive with normal sounds again, squirrels chattering, leaves rustling. Everything was as it should be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was holding its breath, waiting to exhale. That night I checked the barn lights before bed. They were off. I checked them again at midnight. Off. At 3 a.m., unable to sleep, I looked out my window and saw every light blazing. This time I didn't go out. I closed the curtains and tried not to think about what might be standing in that lit barn, waiting patiently for me to investigate. Tried not to wonder if somewhere in those woods, between 2 beech trees, a corpulent figure in colonial dress was hanging in the darkness, chin to chest, arms at his sides. Tried not to notice that when I finally did fall asleep, I dreamed of walking in perfect circles around a dead tree while something screamed up from the earth below me, and translucent spheres appeared one by one in my footsteps, marking a path I'd already taken. In the morning, the barn lights were off again. They always are, when morning comes. I'm still here, still helping Uncle Vernon with the farm, still sleeping in the same room I've had for 3 years. Dalton left 2 weeks later, said he'd found work upstate. He didn't meet my eyes when he said goodbye. Sometimes, just before dusk, I see the barn lights flicker, just once, just enough to remind me they're waiting. And on quiet nights when the wind dies down, I hear it, that distant screaming, rising and falling like it's echoing up from somewhere impossibly deep. I don't go into the woods anymore, but I see him sometimes, in my peripheral vision, when I'm crossing the yard at twilight. That soft, doughy figure suspended in the air, always at the edge of the tree line, watching from whatever impossible space he occupies between this world and somewhere else. The worst part isn't wondering if I imagined it all. The worst part is wondering if it matters. Because real or not, supernatural or psychosis, every night those lights come on by themselves. And every morning, I wake up to find new egg-white husks dried in a perfect line from the woods to my door, closer each time, as if something is very slowly, very patiently, finding its way home. Story 10. The building had been old when my grandfather was young, or so the landlord claimed when I signed the lease. Ground floor, he'd said, like it was a selling point. Private entrance through the kitchen, access to the shared storage shed out back. He hadn't mentioned the way sound carried through the walls at night, or how the floorboards in that shed groaned under no visible weight. I moved in during October, when Salt Lake City's air turned crisp, and the mountains loomed dark against the evening sky. The apartment suited me. High ceilings, thick crown molding, the kind of character you don't find in modern construction. My dog, a rust-colored mutt I'd had for 3 years, seemed to approve. He'd marked every corner of the place within an hour, claimed the worn rug near the radiator as his territory. The kitchen door opened onto a small concrete pad, then 3 steps down to a narrow yard shared with the other ground floor tenant. Beyond that, maybe 20 feet of patchy grass separated us from the shed. It was larger than I'd expected, more of a converted garage, really, with space enough for several tenants' overflow. Old paint cans, boxes of Christmas decorations, forgotten furniture slowly composing in the dark. I didn't think much about it those first weeks. I was busy with the move, with settling into a new routine at work, with learning the rhythm of this place. But the dog noticed something before I did. It started with small things. He'd pause at the kitchen door, nose working the gap beneath it, a low rumble building in his chest. I'd open it, find nothing but the empty yard and the shed's dark bulk against the fence. Sometimes I'd step out with him, let him sniff around while I smoked a cigarette in the cold air, watching my breath cloud and dissipate. The shed had a door. Two doors, actually. One that faced the yard, padlocked and weathered, and another on the far side that opened to the alley. The landlord had given me a key to the padlock, but I hadn't needed it yet. My boxes were still stacked in the spare bedroom, waiting for me to find the motivation to unpack them properly. The first incident happened on a Tuesday night in early November. I'd let the dog out around 11, stood in the doorway while he did his business. The night was still, the kind of dead silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. He'd wandered toward the shed, sniffing along its foundation, when he went rigid. Not the alert stance of a dog catching a scent, something else. Something that made the hair along his spine stand up in a ridge. Then he barked. Sharp, urgent, the bark he reserved for threats. And he bolted back toward me, past me, into the kitchen with his tail tucked low. I called after him, but he kept going, didn't stop until he reached the living room. I stood there in the doorway, one hand on the frame, listening. The silence had changed. It felt occupied now, like the pause between words when someone's deciding whether to speak. I strained to hear anything, the rustle of an animal, footsteps, the creak of old wood settling. Instead, I heard dragging, a slow, deliberate sound, like palms sliding across rough concrete. It came from inside the shed, moving from left to right, from the alley side door toward the one that faced me. The sound was intimate, wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Not the scurry of a rat or the shuffle of a raccoon. Something being pulled, or pulling itself. I stepped back inside and locked the door. The deadbolt's click sounded too loud, too final. I stood with my back against it, listening to my own breathing, waiting for the dragging sound to continue. It didn't. The silence rushed back in, filling every space. My dog refused to come into the kitchen for 2 days after that. I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings made sounds. Pipes groaned. Wood expanded and contracted. Foundations settled. The shed was probably full of junk that shifted when the temperature changed. Maybe a homeless person had gotten in through the alley door, was sleeping rough in there. That thought bothered me more than the alternatives I didn't want to consider. I mentioned it to my upstairs neighbor when I saw her collecting mail. She was older, had lived in the building for 15 years. Did she ever hear anything strange from the shed? She'd looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not concerned, exactly, but careful. She said the previous ground floor tenant had moved out suddenly, left some of his things in the shed. The landlord hadn't gotten around to clearing it out yet. She said it quickly, like she wanted to move past the topic, and excused herself before I could ask anything else. That night, I stood at my kitchen window for a long time, staring at the shed's dark outline. No lights in there, no movement. Just the bulk of it, patient and still against the fence. I made sure the door was locked, checked it 3 times, before going to bed. The weeks that followed brought their own strangeness, though nothing as overt as that dragging sound. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision when I passed the kitchen. Shadows that didn't quite match the light source. Shapes that resolved into nothing when I looked directly. The dog developed a new habit of sitting in the living room doorway, staring down the hall toward the kitchen, occasionally whining low in his throat. Then I felt it. I was making coffee one morning, early, before dawn. The radiator hissed and clanked, pushing heat through the old pipes. I had my back to the kitchen door when something passed through me. Not through the room, through me, a sensation like cold water in my veins, spreading from my spine outward, raising goosebumps across my arms and neck. It carried a weight with it, a pressure that made my ears pop. I spun around. Nothing. The door was closed, locked. But the sensation lingered, and beneath it, something else wormed into my awareness. A smell. Faint at first, then stronger. Like earth that had been burned, scorched soil and ash, and something organic left too long in heat. The smell followed me through the apartment. It was strongest near the kitchen, but I caught traces of it elsewhere. In the bathroom, in the hallway. Once even in my bedroom when I woke at 3 a.m. with my heart hammering. The dog smelled it too. He'd sneeze and back away, shaking his head like he'd inhaled water. I bought air fresheners, left windows open despite the cold, scrubbed every surface I could reach. The smell persisted, or maybe it didn't. Maybe it faded, and I just convinced myself I still detected it. The way you can taste something hours after eating it, a phantom sensation that won't let go. I started sleeping poorly. My dreams, when I could remember them, were full of thresholds, doorways I couldn't quite cross, rooms that led back to themselves, corridors that narrowed until I had to turn sideways, had to squeeze through with my chest pressed against walls that felt organic, that seemed to breathe. December brought snow, heavy and wet, muffling the city in white. I worked from home more, avoided going out unless necessary. The isolation wasn't helping. I knew that, recognized it, but couldn't seem to break the pattern. The dog and I existed in our own bubble, orbiting around the kitchen door we both avoided. Then came the warm night. It was unseasonable, mid-December, but 50 degrees, the snow turning to slush. I'd opened windows to air out the apartment, get rid of the stale smell that had nothing to do with burned earth and everything to do with being sealed inside for too long. I was in the living room, half asleep in front of the television, when I heard the kitchen door creak. I'd left it ajar. Just a crack, just enough to let the air circulate. I'd felt safe doing it. The inner door was closed. The dog was with me, but now the dog was walking down the hallway, moving with that same rigid posture from weeks ago, every muscle taut. I followed, my heart already racing. The kitchen was dark except for the ambient light from the street lamp outside. The door stood open, not wide, maybe 6 inches, enough to see the concrete pad and the first step down. The dog had stopped at the threshold, staring. I should have called him back. Should have closed the door, locked it, gone to bed. Instead, I moved closer, looked over his head, tried to see what held his attention. The shed door was open, not the one with the padlock. The other one, the alley door I'd never seen unlocked. It gaped like a mouth, darkness visible beyond it, even darker than the night around it. And in that darkness, something moved. No, not moved. Shifted position, adjusted itself. My eyes struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. The shape was wrong, proportioned in a way that hurt to look at. Low to the ground, halfway up the stairs that I could just barely see in the ambient light. The limbs, I thought they were limbs, seemed too long and too thin, like a daddy long-legged spider magnified to human scale. But the mass suggested something denser, something compressed down into itself. It squatted there, perfectly still, and then it turned. The movement happened in stages, mechanical and precise. First, the upper portion, what might have been shoulders, though the angles were wrong, rotated maybe 30 degrees. Then, after a pause that might have been a second or an hour, the rest followed. No smooth motion, no natural flow. Just these distinct, separate adjustments, until whatever served as its face pointed toward me. I couldn't see features. The darkness was too complete, the distance too great. But I felt its attention lock onto me with physical force, a pressure behind my eyes that made them water. The dog began to back away, a high whine escaping his throat. I grabbed for his collar, but my hand wouldn't obey, stayed frozen at my side. We stood there, the three of us, me, the dog, the thing on the stairs, locked in a moment that stretched like taffy, pulling thinner and thinner, but never quite breaking. Then my body remembered how to move. I threw myself at the door, hit it with my shoulder, heard the latch catch. The deadbolt took 2 tries. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip it, but finally it slid home. I scooped up the dog and carried him to the living room, both of us trembling. I didn't sleep that night, didn't even try. I sat on the couch with all the lights on, the dog pressed against my leg, listening for sounds from the kitchen. None came. No dragging, no footsteps, no breathing or scratching or anything that would confirm what I'd seen. Dawn arrived with painful slowness. When gray light finally filtered through the windows, I forced myself to go to the kitchen. The door was still locked. I looked through the window above the sink, angled my view toward the shed. Both doors were closed. I called in sick to work, spent the day researching the building's history, the previous tenants, anything that might explain what was happening. The internet offered fragments, a mention in a historical register, a few old photos, nothing substantial. No reports of deaths or accidents, no tragic history that might spawn the kind of story people told around campfires. The previous tenant's name was Gideon. I found it in an old news article, something about a community garden project he'd helped organize. His picture showed a thin man with dark circles under his eyes, forcing a smile. The article was from 2 years ago. I had no way to contact him, no way to ask what he'd experienced here, why he'd left. The dog wouldn't go near the kitchen door after that night. Not for food, not for treats. Not even when I carried his bowl to the far end of the living room and tried to coax him through. He'd press himself against the opposite wall, shaking, until I gave up and fed him elsewhere. I started using the front entrance exclusively, walking around the building to reach the parking area. It added 10 minutes to any trip, but I couldn't bring myself to unlock that kitchen door. I told myself it was temporary, that I was being ridiculous, that I'd see something in the daylight that would explain everything and make me laugh at my own paranoia. But I didn't believe it. The presence, I'd started thinking of it that way. The presence didn't leave. I felt it most strongly near the kitchen, but it had begun to seep further into the apartment, like water staining drywall, spreading dark fingers through my home. Some mornings I'd wake to find the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in my bedroom, my breath misting in the air, frost forming on the inside of the windows. Other times I'd hear that dragging sound, distant but persistent, coming from behind the walls. I looked at apartments online but couldn't bring myself to schedule viewings. What would I tell a new landlord? That I was running from something I couldn't name, couldn't prove, couldn't even reliably describe? That I'd abandoned a lease because my dog was scared, and I'd seen something in the dark that might have been nothing at all? Because that was the question, wasn't it? The one that kept me frozen here, unable to leave or stay, caught in liminal space between belief and denial. Had I actually seen something that night? Or had my isolation and poor sleep and overactive imagination crafted a monster from shadows and old wood? Was the smell of burned earth real? Or a symptom of some neurological issue I should be addressing with a doctor rather than feeding with fear? I wanted proof. Some concrete evidence that would force me to either flee or seek help. But the apartment offered nothing definitive, just this constant suggestion of wrongness, this feeling of sharing space with something that didn't belong. Last night, I woke at 2:47 a.m. I know because I checked my phone immediately, needed the blue glow of the screen to push back the darkness. The dog was growling, a sound I'd never heard from him before, deep and continuous. I followed his gaze to the bedroom doorway. The hallway beyond was darker than it should have been. Not just an absence of light, but a presence of shadow. Something that absorbed and held illumination, rather than simply not reflecting it. And in that darkness, very faintly, I heard breathing. Not the sound of air moving in and out of lungs, but something drier, more mechanical, like pages turning, or leather creaking, or kindling settling in a cold fireplace. I'm sitting here now, writing this as the sun comes up, trying to organize my thoughts before they fragment completely. The dog is asleep finally, exhausted from a night of vigilance. I should be exhausted too, but I feel electrified, every nerve ending firing, waiting for the next sign. The kitchen door is still locked. I can see it from here, white paint chipped near the handle, deadbolt secure. Beyond it, the shed squats in the gray morning light, patient as a headstone. I don't know if I'll ever open that door again. Don't know if the thing I saw is still out there, or if it was ever there at all, or if it somehow made its way inside, inch by inch, night by night, until the distinction between out there and in here becomes meaningless. What frightens me most isn't the possibility that something impossible exists in that shed. It's the growing certainty that it doesn't matter whether it's real or not. The fear is real. The locked door is real. The life I'm building around this terror, the avoidance, the isolation, the way I'm slowly backing away from my own existence, that's real too. And maybe that's what it wants. Maybe that's what it's always wanted. I hear the floorboards creak in the kitchen. The dog's eyes open. Find mine. We wait together, listen together, as something that might be settling wood or footsteps or nothing at all moves through the space we've abandoned. The sun is rising. In an hour, I'll need to decide whether to call the landlord, call a psychiatrist, call someone, anyone who might help me understand what's happening here. But for now, I sit with my dog in the growing light, both of us staring at that closed kitchen door, wondering what's standing on the other side, wondering if it's wondering the same thing about us. Story 11. The first mistake was thinking I'd be alone. I'd driven 7 hours from Indianapolis with nothing but my Nikon, a borrowed tent, and the kind of stubborn optimism that comes from scrolling through too many astrophotography forums. Hoosier National Forest in October. The post promised clear skies, minimal light pollution, and isolation thick enough to drown in. Perfect conditions for capturing the Milky Way in all its cosmic indifference. The campsite I chose wasn't listed on any map. Just a widening in the fire road where the hardwoods thinned enough to pitch a tent, far enough from the designated areas that I wouldn't have to deal with weekend warriors and their beer coolers. The ranger at the station had given me a long look when I'd mentioned going off trail, but he'd signed my permit anyway. His only advice had been to watch for black bears and to make noise when hiking at dusk. I hadn't planned on making noise. I'd planned on silence. The afternoon settled over the forest like a held breath. I spent the dying light hours setting up my gear, adjusting the tripod on the uneven ground, programming the intervalometer for the long exposures I'd need once full darkness hit. The trees here grew dense and low, their canopies forming a cathedral ceiling that blocked out everything but narrow columns of sky. Not ideal for wide-angle shots, but the challenge appealed to me. I've always been drawn to difficult angles, to forcing beauty out of obstinate subjects. By the time I'd eaten my freeze-dried dinner and checked my equipment twice more, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. The wind picked up, moving through the understory with a sound like rushing water. I zipped my jacket and settled into the camp chair, waiting for the sky to give up its stars. That's when I saw it. Not saw it exactly. Became aware of it. The way you become aware of being watched in a crowded room, that prickling certainty that settles between your shoulder blades and refuses to leave. I'd been staring up at the emerging constellations, my neck bent back at an uncomfortable angle, when my peripheral vision caught movement on the opposite embankment. The fire road cut through a modest ravine here, and the far slope rose about 20 feet, thick with saplings and undergrowth. At the top, where the low canopy began, something stood. My first thought was deer. My second thought was that no deer stood that tall. It was maybe 8 feet high, perhaps more. Difficult to judge distance and size in the failing light, but it had mass, the kind of density that makes space around it seem to bend inward. The shape was wrong for any animal I knew. Too vertical, too still. A silhouette against the darkening forest that didn't move even when the wind gusted hard enough to make the surrounding branches sway and dip. The wind. That's what I noticed next. While everything around this shape bent and rustled, the thing itself remained motionless except for one detail. Its surface rippled. Like tall grass in a breeze, like fur or hair catching air currents, the covering moved in waves across its form. I sat frozen in my chair, my breath shallow and controlled. Some animal instinct older than reason told me that movement would be a mistake. That acknowledgement would be a mistake. So I did something that felt insane, even as I did it. I went completely slack. Dropped my shoulders, let my head loll to one side, kept my eyes half-lidded and unfocused. Played dead. Played mannequin. Whatever it was, wherever in the evolutionary chain it sat, maybe it hunted movement. Maybe stillness would bore it. I counted seconds in my head. Lost count at 200 and something. My left leg started to cramp, a hot needle of pain that screamed at me to shift position. I ignored it. The shape across the ravine didn't move, didn't approach, didn't leave. Just stood there as the last light bled out of the sky, and the temperature continued its steady drop toward freezing. When I finally risked a glance, slow, glacial, barely moving my eyes. The embankment was empty. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't even try. I packed everything into the car except the tent, started the engine and sat there with the heat running and the doors locked until dawn. Told myself I'd drive back to civilization at first light. Told myself a dozen rational explanations for what I'd seen. Bear standing on hind legs, trick of the shadows, a dead tree with an unusual shape that my exhausted brain had animated into threat. But I didn't leave. Dawn came cold and crystalline, the kind of October morning that makes you forget nighttime ever existed. The forest looked benign in the slanted sunlight, almost welcoming. I made coffee on my camp stove, the smell of it grounding me back into the practical world of cause and effect. Whatever I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, belonged to darkness. The day was mine. I spent the morning hiking the surrounding trails, shooting the canopy from various angles, trying to salvage something useful from this trip. The photos came out technically perfect but emotionally hollow. Trees, more trees, branches against sky. Nothing that would make anyone pause while scrolling. Nothing that captured the crushing weight of this place. I got back to camp around 2 in the afternoon, tired enough that sleep seemed possible. The tent was how I'd left it, my sleeping bag still visible through the mesh door. I heated up another meal and sat outside eating it, already planning my evening shoot. The night before felt increasingly distant, increasingly stupid. I'd panicked. Simple as that. The first nut hit my rain fly at 3:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I was checking my watch, calculating how many hours until astronomical twilight. The impact made a sharp thwack against the taut fabric, loud enough to make me flinch. I looked up at the canopy, thinking maybe a squirrel had dislodged something, but there were no squirrels visible, no birds, no movement at all in the branches above. Then another nut hit. This one struck dead center of the tent roof, right where the support pole created a peak. Then another, and another. Each impact was precise, deliberate, spaced about 10 seconds apart. I stood up slowly, scanning the tree line. The nuts were black walnuts. I could see their distinctive round shapes bouncing off the tent and rolling away into the leaf litter, but they were falling from impossible angles, not dropping from directly above, but arcing in from the surrounding forest, each trajectory different, but each impact clustered within a 2-foot circle on my tent. This went on for 17 minutes. I counted every single impact. 23 nuts, each thrown with the kind of accuracy that makes your stomach drop. When they finally stopped, the silence that followed felt aggressive. I told myself I was leaving, packed my day gear into the car. But some stubborn part of me, the same part that had driven 7 hours for difficult shots, that had chosen isolation over comfort, refused to run. I'd paid for this permit. I'd driven all this way, and nothing had actually happened. No threat, no contact, just nuts on a tent and a shape in the shadows. I reset my camera equipment as the afternoon bled into evening. If something was out there, if something was watching, then maybe it would show up in the long exposures. Maybe the camera would see what my eyes couldn't rationalize away. The darkness came faster than I expected, swallowing the forest in stages. First, the undergrowth disappeared into shadow, then the tree trunks became black columns, then the canopy merged with the sky until only the stars remained visible through the gaps. I triggered the first exposure and settled into my chair to wait. My headlamp switched off, my breathing controlled. The first roar came at 2:14 a.m. It was low, impossibly low, the kind of frequency you feel in your chest cavity before you hear it with your ears. A resonance that vibrated through the ground and up through the legs of my chair, making my teeth ache. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, a sustained note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then silence. Absolute silence. Even the wind had stopped. I sat perfectly still, my hands gripping the arms of the chair, my camera clicking through its programmed sequence behind me. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent. My heartbeat hammered so loud in my ears I was sure it could be heard a mile away. The second roar came 30 seconds later. Same pitch, same duration, but from a different direction, east instead of west, as if the source had moved a quarter mile in half a minute. Another 30-second pause. Then the third roar, this one due north. 3 points of a triangle, me in the center. The silence that followed pressed down like a physical weight. And then I heard it. The crack and rustle of branches breaking. But not below. Above. High up in the canopy, something was moving through the treetops. Not a single path, but multiple paths, spreading out in different directions like the spokes of a wheel. Heavy footsteps that somehow found purchase on branches too thin to support significant weight. The sound of wood splintering and leaves cascading filled the air from every direction, a retreating wave of disturbance that moved away from my position in a perfect radial pattern. And beneath it all, barely audible but unmistakable, a drum beat. 4 steady beats. Pause. 4 more beats. Pause. Deep and rhythmic, like a heartbeat slowed to a ritual tempo. Like something communicating across distance in a language older than words. The sound had texture to it, not the hollow boom of struck wood, but something more organic, more resonant. 4 beats. Pause. 4 beats. Then headlights swept across the trees. A vehicle was coming up the fire road, its engine grinding in low gear as it climbed the grade toward my position. The drumbeat stopped instantly. The sounds in the canopy ceased. In the space of a heartbeat, the forest returned to normal nocturnal stillness. Crickets, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind in leaves. A park ranger's truck pulled into the clearing, its spotlight sweeping across my tent and gear. The ranger, a different one from the station, older, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in these woods, climbed out and approached with the casual wariness of someone who's interrupted illegal activity before. I gave him the basic story. Camping permit, astrophotography. No problems. He examined my setup with professional interest, asked a few questions about the camera equipment, then told me to be careful and drove away, his taillights disappearing back down the fire road. The rest of the night passed without incident. I didn't hear the drumbeat again, didn't hear anything moving in the canopy. As dawn broke, I finally let myself examine what I'd captured. The camera had clicked through 347 exposures. I scrolled through them on the LCD screen, my coffee growing cold in my other hand. Stars, trees, more stars. Nothing unusual, nothing that shouldn't be there, until the last sequence. The images were out of focus, the canopy rendered as a dark blur against the lighter sky. Camera shake maybe, or a focusing error in the darkness. But in 7 consecutive frames, there were shapes, vertical forms standing among the trees, tall and distinct, in positions where no trunk should be. I zoomed in on each one, my hands starting to shake. They weren't trees. The proportions were wrong. The spacing was wrong. And in the blurred way that movement appears in long exposures, they seemed to be facing toward the center, toward my position. I deleted the star shots, every single one, formatted the card twice, kept only the canopy images, the blurred, useless, damning images that showed nothing and everything. I broke camp in under 20 minutes, throwing gear into the car with none of my usual careful organization. The ranger station was empty when I returned the permit, just a drop box with a slot. I drove back toward Indianapolis with the heat blasting, even though the morning had already warmed into the 60s. At a rest stop outside Bloomington, I pulled out my laptop and connected the camera. The images were still there, of course. Digital files don't just disappear because you want them to. I opened the last one, the clearest of the blurred shots, and stared at it until my vision swam. 7 shapes, 7 watchers in the canopy. And in the extreme foreground, barely visible at the bottom edge of the frame, there was an 8th, standing right behind where my chair had been. I can still see them when I close my eyes. I can still hear that drumbeat. 4 beats. Pause. 4 beats. In the quiet moments before sleep. And sometimes, in crowded places, I feel that old prickling sensation between my shoulder blades. That certainty of being watched. I've never gone back to Hoosier National Forest. Never will. But late at night, when I'm developing shots in my darkroom and the chemicals smell particularly sharp, I wonder if leaving was enough. If distance means anything to something that can move through treetops like smoke, that can throw nuts with sniper precision, that can surround you in minutes, the images are still on my hard drive. I've tried to delete them a dozen times, but my finger never completes the action. Because as long as they exist, I can look at them, can study them, can remind myself that I didn't imagine it, that it was real, or that I'm losing my mind. And I honestly don't know which possibility terrifies me more. Story 12. The air smelled wrong before we even reached the bridge. We'd spent 4 hours training team roping at the reserve's equestrian center, my shoulders burning from holding tension in the rope, my palms raw despite the gloves. The two guys I'd partnered with, one who managed a feed store 2 counties over, another who worked nights at a processing plant, had already loaded their gear and were waiting by my truck when I suggested we check the footbridge. The old wooden structure crossed the narrowest part of the river, and I'd heard from the center's owner that recent flooding might have weakened the supports. Since we'd be hauling trailers back this way next weekend, it seemed worth a look. The drive from the training pens took us deeper into the reserve than I'd been before. The dirt road narrowed, branches scraping against the truck's sides with sounds like fingernails on metal. My headlights swept across dense underbrush, catching movement that resolved into nothing when I tried to focus on it. The feed store guy sat in the passenger seat, checking something on his phone. The night shift worker had dozed off in the back, his head bouncing against the window with each rut in the road. That's when the smell hit us, thick and organic, like meat left too long in summer heat, but with an underwater quality that coated the back of my throat. I cracked the window to let it out, but it only seemed to let more in. The headlights found eyes first. Yellow, catching the light like coins at the bottom of a well, unblinking in the brush maybe 15 feet from the road. I slowed instinctively, expecting a deer to bolt across our path, but the eyes just watched, floating in the darkness with no visible body beneath them. My passenger noticed them too. He stopped scrolling and sat forward, his hand moving toward the dashboard as if he could push us past them faster. Probably just he started to say, but the eyes blinked out. Not like an animal turning its head or bounding away. They simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next, as if someone had flicked a switch. The bridge appeared around the next bend, its weathered boards silver in the moonlight. We all climbed out, our boots crunching on gravel, and spent 20 minutes checking the supports with flashlights. Everything looked solid enough, though the water below moved faster than I'd expected, black and muscular in the darkness. The sound of it filled the air, a constant rushing that made conversation difficult. On the drive back, nobody mentioned the eyes. The night shift worker stayed awake this time, staring out at the darkness with an expression I couldn't quite read. We reached the center's main building, a low cabin with a covered porch where trainers sometimes stayed overnight, around 1 in the morning. The owner let us know we could sleep there if we wanted, rather than drive the 2 hours back to town. We'd brought sleeping bags anticipating the offer. The cabin had a main room with a kitchenette, a wood stove that still held heat from earlier in the evening, and a pair of narrow windows facing the parking area. We'd spread our sleeping bags across the floor, too tired to care about comfort. The conversation drifted the way it does when exhaustion starts pulling at the edges of consciousness. We talked about horses we'd known, close calls we'd had, the mechanics of a good rope. Our words came slower, punctuated by longer silences, until eventually the night shift worker was snoring softly, and the feed store guy had rolled over to face the wall. I was nearly asleep when I heard it. A scratching sound, deliberate and patient, moving across the window glass. Not the random scrape of a branch. This had intention behind it. The careful pressure of something testing the surface. I lay perfectly still, my sleeping bag suddenly too warm, listening to the rhythm of it, back and forth, like someone drawing invisible lines with their fingernail. Then came the tapping, light, almost playful, but following a pattern that made my stomach clench with recognition. It matched the cadence of our earlier conversation, the rhythm of our laughter, the tempo of our overlapping voices. Someone or something was recreating the musicality of how we'd sounded just an hour before. I wanted to wake the others, but my throat had closed around the impulse. The tapping continued for perhaps 3 minutes, never loud enough to be aggressive, always just present enough to be unmistakable. Then it stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound had been, pressing against my eardrums until I had to swallow to equalize the pressure. I didn't sleep well after that. Every small sound, the building settling, the wind in the eaves, the distant call of something in the woods, pulled me back to alertness. When gray light finally began seeping through the windows, I was grateful to have an excuse to move. The others woke slowly, stretching and groaning. I made coffee while they rolled up their sleeping bags, and we stood on the porch drinking it, looking out at the morning mist that hung over the training pens. That's when the feed store guy noticed the tracks. "The hell is that?" He was pointing at the dirt alongside the porch, where the ground sloped gently down toward the gravel parking area. I followed his gaze and felt something cold slide down my spine. Hoof prints led from the porch to the fence line, maybe 20 feet away. But they weren't like any hoof prints I'd seen before. Each print showed 2 distinct points, cloven, like a deer or goat, but they formed a single perfectly straight line. No staggered pattern of left and right, no variation in depth or spacing, just one track, walking in a way that nothing with 4 legs should be able to walk. We followed them to the fence, none of us speaking. The prints ended abruptly at the lowest rail, as if whatever made them had simply stepped over and continued on the other side without leaving any mark. The night shift worker crouched down, studying the impressions. He worked with his hands. I'd seen him handling equipment at the processing plant, and had the kind of practical knowledge that came from years of paying attention to physical details. "Should be 4 sets of these," he said quietly. 2 front, 2 back. Even if something was walking funny, you'd see the pattern change. This is just... He trailed off, standing up and brushing dirt from his hands. I tried to tell myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe 2 different animals had walked the same path, perfectly aligned. Maybe the morning dew had melted the edges of more complicated tracks, simplifying them into this single line. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, and we were all seeing patterns in random marks. But I couldn't make myself believe any of those explanations. We loaded the trailer in near silence, our earlier camaraderie replaced by a tension that none of us wanted to acknowledge. I was hooking the trailer to my truck's hitch when the night shift worker touched my shoulder and pointed up the slope toward the tree line. The buck stood on a small rise, perhaps 40 yards away. Even at that distance, I could see something was profoundly wrong with it. Its hide hung loose, stretched over bones that jutted at harsh angles, as if the animal had been assembled from parts that didn't quite fit together. The morning light showed every contour of its skull beneath skin that looked paper-thin and translucent. But it was the expression, if you could call it that made me stop moving entirely. The buck's mouth hung open in what my brain insisted on interpreting as a smile, lips pulled back far enough to expose every tooth in its jaw. No animal holds its mouth that way. No living thing maintains that kind of rigid, unnatural position without the muscles trembling from strain. I stared at it, unable to look away, counting the seconds in my head. 5, 10, 15. The buck didn't move, didn't blink, didn't twitch or shift its weight the way any creature with functioning nerves would have to do. It just stood there, that impossible smile fixed on its skull-like face, watching us with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. The others had noticed it too. The feed store guy had gone very still, his hand still on the trailer latch. The night shift worker breathed out slowly, the kind of controlled exhale you use when you're trying not to panic. "Is that..." The feed store guy started, but didn't finish. I blinked. Just once. A purely reflexive action. The rise was empty. No deer, no movement in the brush, no sound of hooves retreating through the undergrowth. The buck had simply ceased to be there, leaving only the slope and the trees and the weak morning sunlight. "Did you..." I began, but the night shift worker was already nodding. Yeah, I saw it too." We got in the truck. I pulled out of the parking area carefully, checking my mirrors more often than necessary, half expecting to see that skeletal figure standing in the road behind us. The drive back to the highway took 30 minutes, and none of us spoke. The reserve's property stretched for miles, the dirt road winding through forest that seemed darker than it should have been with full daylight filtering through the canopy. About halfway out, I noticed the smell again. Wet meat and river water, thick enough to taste. It filled the truck's cab despite all the windows being rolled up, and this time it came with a new element. Something like copper and old pennies, metallic and organic at once. The feed store guy rolled down his window, letting in cold air that should have helped, but didn't. The smell stayed with us until we finally turned onto the paved highway, where it dissipated so quickly that its absence felt almost as unsettling as its presence had been. We stopped at a gas station 20 miles from the reserve. While the others used the restroom, I stood by the pump, watching the numbers roll on the meter and trying to organize my thoughts into something rational. We'd been tired. The lighting had been poor. Our minds had filled in details that weren't there, found patterns in randomness, mistaken ordinary events for something sinister. But when the night shift worker came back, he stopped beside me and spoke in a low voice, as if worried about being overheard despite the empty lot. "The tracks," he said. "I've worked around livestock my whole life, processed thousands of head. I know what hoof prints look like when something's injured, when it's walking on 3 legs, when the weight distribution is off. Those prints weren't from anything injured." He paused, squinting at the road ahead. "They were from something that moves on 2 legs but wants you to think it doesn't." He walked away before I could respond, climbing back into the truck and closing the door with more force than necessary. The drive home took 2 hours. I dropped off the night shift worker first, then the feed store guy. Both said they'd let me know about next weekend's training session, but their voices carried the tone of people who already knew they wouldn't be returning. I didn't argue with them. I thought about calling the reserve's owner, asking if he'd experienced anything unusual on the property. But what would I say? That I'd seen eyes that disappeared? That something had tapped on the window in the rhythm of human conversation? That hoofprints followed an impossible path? That a dying deer had smiled at me and vanished when I blinked? It all sounded insane when I tried to arrange it into words. 3 weeks have passed since that night. I haven't been back to the reserve. The owner called once asking if I'd be interested in another training session, and I found myself inventing excuses about scheduling conflicts and family obligations. He accepted them without question, but something in his voice suggested he'd heard similar excuses before. I've been dreaming about the bridge. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams where I'm standing on those weathered boards, looking down at the black water rushing beneath, and I can feel something standing behind me. Something patient and tall. Something with too many joints in its legs. Something that's learned to imitate the sound of human laughter with perfect, uncanny precision. Last night I woke to a tapping on my bedroom window, soft and rhythmic, following the pattern of a conversation I'd had with my brother that evening at dinner. The cadence of our voices, the spaces between our words, recreated with meticulous accuracy. I didn't look at the window. I lay in the darkness with my eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to that patient, playful tapping, and I understood with absolute clarity that looking would confirm something I wasn't ready to accept. That there are places where the boundaries aren't as solid as we pretend they are. That attention can be returned. That being watched means being remembered. The tapping stopped eventually. But sometimes, when I'm standing in my kitchen, or sitting in my truck, or walking through the ordinary spaces of my daily life, I catch a smell like wet meat and river water. I see eyes in my peripheral vision that vanish when I turn my head. I notice tracks in the mud that follow paths nothing on 4 legs should be able to walk. And I wonder if something followed me home from the reserve. Or if something has always been here, patient and smiling, waiting for the moment when I pay it the wrong kind of attention. I wonder if I'll ever know the difference between those possibilities. I wonder if the difference matters at all. Story 13. I'd told myself I was going back to document it properly. That's what I wrote in the permit application, a follow-up survey of trail conditions on the eastern boundary of Mammoth Cave National Park, where the mapped paths dissolve into deer trails and the canopy thickens into something prehistoric. But documentation wasn't why I'd packed 3 extra batteries for my headlamp, or why I'd slipped the Glock into my pack's waist pocket, or why I'd chosen a Tuesday in late October when the park rangers would be stretched thin across 200 miles of cave systems and surface trails. I was going back because of the rope. 3 months earlier, I'd stumbled onto a section of trail that shouldn't have existed, not on any map, not in any database. Someone had tied bright orange surveyor's cord between the trees at chest height, creating a perimeter maybe 40 yards across. The cord was new, the knots clean and professional, and at the center of the cordoned area sat a blue plastic tarp weighted down with stones. When I'd lifted the edge, the smell hit me first. Kibble. Dog food. Cheap stuff. The kind that comes in 50-pound bags from feed stores. Someone had dumped at least 3 bags worth onto the bare dirt, creating a mound that insects had already begun to colonize. I'd photographed it, filed a report, assumed it was some weird hunting tactic or a prank by local kids. But when I'd checked back 2 weeks later, the cord was gone, the kibble scattered and mostly consumed, and someone had carved a symbol into the trunk of the nearest oak. A stick figure with branching antlers and too many legs. Now, pushing through the same curtain of wild grapevines that marked the trail's end, I felt the October air press against my skin like something with weight. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since I'd left my truck at the trailhead. The canopy here was dense enough to trap the humidity, creating a microclimate that smelled of rot and mushroom bloom. Every breath tasted of copper. The orange surveyor's cord was back. I stopped at the perimeter's edge, one hand instinctively moving to the gun's grip. The knots were identical to the ones I'd photographed in July, Prusik hitches, the kind climbers use. The rope sagged slightly between trees, as if it had been up for weeks, but the bright orange suggested otherwise. Orange fades fast in direct sunlight. This cord looked factory fresh. Beyond the perimeter, the ground had been disturbed. Not excavated exactly, but churned, as if something had pawed at the earth repeatedly, creating shallow depressions that filled with shadow in the failing afternoon light. The oak with the carved figure loomed at the western edge, its symbol now weathered but still distinct. Someone had added to it, small scratches radiating from the antlered head like spokes, or rays, or searching fingers. I should have turned back. Every instinct refined by 15 years of backcountry surveying told me this was a situation that required backup, paperwork, proper protocol. Instead, I ducked under the cord and walked to the center of the perimeter, where my boots sank half an inch into soft earth. The silence was wrong, not peaceful, evacuated. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, none of the ambient rustle that characterizes healthy deciduous forest. Even the insects seemed muted, their buzz reduced to a low-frequency hum that I felt more than heard. I knelt and ran my fingers through the churned dirt. It was fine, almost silty, and came away on my skin with an oily residue that wouldn't quite brush off. That's when I heard the first crack. Not a branch breaking. The sound was too sharp, too localized. It came from my left, somewhere in the dense undergrowth where the vines tangled into impenetrable walls. A single purposeful snap, like someone stepping on a dry stick. I stood slowly, hand on the gun, scanning the vegetation for movement. Nothing. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against my eardrums until they popped. Another crack. Closer now. 10 yards, maybe less. I pulled the Glock free and thumbed off the safety, the mechanical click absurdly loud in the smothered quiet. Called out. My voice sounded thin and strained, asking if anyone was there, announcing myself as a park surveyor. The words died against the underbrush without echo. The response was a series of cracks in rapid succession, creating a rough semicircle around my position. Whatever was making the sound was moving, or there were multiple sources. I backed toward the perimeter cord, keeping my eyes on the dense vegetation, trying to separate genuine movement from the brain's pattern-seeking desperation. Shadows shifted, vines swayed, but nothing emerged. By the time I retreated beyond the orange rope, the cracking had stopped. The forest's normal ambiance returned gradually. A distant crow, the whisper of wind through dying leaves, my own pulse hammering in my throat. I stood there for 5 full minutes, gun drawn, waiting for something to prove I hadn't imagined the whole sequence. The shadows lengthened, the temperature dropped another notch, and finally, I holstered the weapon and made my way back to the place I'd chosen to camp. I deliberately selected a spot a quarter mile from the perimeter, where a small clearing offered flat ground and a view of my surroundings. By the time I had my tent pitched and my gear organized, dusk had reduced the forest to silhouettes and negative space. I built a small fire in a cleared ring and set water to boil for freeze-dried stew, trying to convince myself that the afternoon's encounter was explainable. Black bears could make those sounds, moving through thick brush. So could deer, or even wild hogs, though they were supposed to be uncommon this far north in the park. The stew tasted like salted cardboard, but I forced it down, maintaining caloric intake the way I'd trained myself to do. Afterward, I strung a bear bag with my food supplies and hung it from a high branch, then arranged my gear in the tent with paranoid precision. Headlamp within reach, knife accessible, gun in its holster beneath my pillow. The routine should have been comforting. It felt like preparation for siege. Full dark came suddenly, the way it does under heavy canopy. My fire had burned down to coals when I heard the footsteps. Not the crack of breaking sticks, actual footsteps. Deliberate, measured, circling my campsite at a distance I estimated at 30 feet. The gait was wrong. Too slow, too careful, with irregular intervals between steps, as if whatever was moving paused frequently to observe. I killed my headlamp and sat motionless in the fire's dying glow, tracking the sound by ear. One complete circle, then another. The steps never approached closer than 30 feet, never receded beyond 40. I wanted to call out again, to break the tension with confrontation, but some survival instinct kept me silent. The steps weren't trying to be stealthy. If anything, they seemed intentionally audible, like someone wanted me to know they were there. But who walks perfect circles around a stranger's camp in total darkness without announcing themselves? Not a ranger, not a lost hiker, not anyone with peaceful intent. The circling continued for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. My eyes adjusted enough to see vague shapes between the trees, trunks, low branches, the formless geometry of understory vegetation, but never anything that explained the footsteps. And then, between one step and the next, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no distant animals, no ambient forest noise. Just my breathing and the faint tick of cooling metal from my camp stove. I remained frozen, waiting for the sound to resume, until my muscles cramped and I had to shift position. That's when something brushed against my tent. The touch was light, exploratory, starting at the tent's rear corner and dragging slowly along the nylon fabric. Not scratching, tracing. The pressure was consistent and deliberate, as if someone was running a finger along the tent's surface, following its contours. I could track the movement by sound, a soft hiss of contact, moving from the back corner forward along the sidewall, passing within inches of where I sat rigid in my sleeping bag. My hand found the gun. I thumbed the safety off with a click that seemed to echo. The tracing stopped. For 3 heartbeats, nothing. Then it resumed, slower now, moving along the tent's front wall toward the zippered entrance. The pressure increased slightly, creating a visible depression in the fabric that caught what little light remained from the coals. I shouted, demanded to know who was there, threatened to shoot. My voice cracked with adrenaline. The tracing stopped again. In the silence, I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears, the desperate bellows of my breathing. Slowly, I reached for the zipper, ready to burst out and confront whatever was outside. Before my fingers touched the pull, the tracing resumed at the back of the tent. Starting at the same corner, following the identical path. Same speed, Same pressure, as if someone was carefully retracing their previous route, or as if they wanted me to understand this was intentional, methodical, a message being delivered in touch. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't move, barely breathed. The tracing continued, back to front to back, over and over in a loop that lasted through the longest night of my life. At some point, exhaustion must have overwhelmed terror, because I jerked awake to gray dawn light and the sound of crows arguing somewhere in the canopy. The gun was still in my hand. My fingers ached from gripping it. Moving carefully, I unzipped the tent and crawled out into morning air that tasted of dew and leaf mold. The first thing I checked was the ground around my tent. The tracks started at the edge of my sleeping pad's footprint, not beside the tent, but inside the perimeter I'd occupied. They were hoofprints or close to it, cloven, sharp-edged, pressed deep into the soft forest floor. But the spacing was wrong. Each print was 6 inches from the last, creating a pattern that suggested something standing still, shifting weight, not walking. And the prints didn't form a path. They clustered, as if whatever made them had stood in place for hours, occasionally adjusting its stance. I followed the tracks away from my tent, my hands shaking so badly I had to steady my phone with both grips to photograph them. The prints led in a rough line toward the nearest oak, maybe 15 feet away. Halfway there, they stopped, just ended, mid-stride, at a point where there was nothing, no tree to climb, no rock to leap to, just open air above leaf litter. The prints resumed on top of the oak's lowest branch, 12 feet off the ground. They were identical, cloven, deep, sharp-edged, as if something had stood beside my sleeping body and then teleported to a branch thick enough to support substantial weight. The bark showed fresh scoring where the hooves had landed, wood fiber bright and raw beneath the gray exterior. I packed my gear in 18 minutes, leaving behind the bear bag and half my supplies in my haste to reach the trail. Didn't run. Running would have meant admitting the panic that thrashed in my chest, but moved fast enough that my breathing came hard and my vision narrowed to the path ahead. The forest seemed to watch me leave. Every shadow held potential movement. Every sound suggested pursuit. I didn't go straight to the trailhead. Some part of my brain, the part that insisted on understanding, on documentation, pulled me back toward the perimeter with the orange cord. I told myself I'd take one more set of photos, mark the GPS coordinates properly, gather enough evidence to justify an official investigation. The perimeter was gone. No orange cord, no disturbed earth, no carved symbol on the oak. I stood in the spot where I'd spent the afternoon, turning in slow circles, trying to reconcile memory with present reality. The trees were the same, the canopy density matched, but the ground was covered in undisturbed leaf litter, and when I approached the oak that had borne the antlered figure, its bark was smooth and weathered, showing years of growth without interruption. I found my own footprints from yesterday, preserved in a patch of soft earth near where the perimeter's center had been. They were the only tracks visible, as if I'd walked into this section of forest alone, circled an empty clearing, then left. In my pack, my phone still held the photos I'd taken, images of orange cord, churned earth, carved symbols. But when I pulled up the photo app, the gallery showed only the thumbnails. Each image, when opened, displayed a loading error, corrupted files. All of them. Even the ones I'd taken that morning of the hoofprints around my tent. I made it to the trailhead by noon and drove to the nearest ranger station, where I sat in my truck for 30 minutes trying to decide what to report. How do you file a complaint about something that leaves no evidence? How do you explain that you're filing based on the certainty that something marked you, traced your shape, left impossible tracks? In the end, I drove home without reporting anything. The old park maps, the ones from the 1960s before the boundaries were redrawn, show that section of forest as part of a place called Goblin Knob. The name appears in faded pencil on one of the geological surveys I keep in my home office, tucked between Horse Thief Canyon and Turnhole Bend. There's no explanation for the name, no story attached, just the designation and the topographical lines that suggest rough terrain. I've checked my calendar 3 times. October 29th was a Tuesday. I returned to the truck on October 30th, Wednesday. but my bank statement shows charges from that same Tuesday, October 29th. Gas station purchases, a coffee shop transaction, made while I was supposedly camping overnight. The timestamps put me in two places at once. One version buying lunch at a diner 30 miles from the park, another version pitching a tent in the forest. My neighbor mentioned seeing me at my mailbox on Tuesday evening, waved at me, said I looked tired, asked if I was working late again. I wasn't home Tuesday evening. I was in the forest. I'm certain of it, or I'm certain I remember being certain. Last week I found dirt under my fingernails, the same silty, oily dirt from the churned ground inside the perimeter. But I haven't been back to the park, haven't been in any forest. I've checked my GPS history, my truck's mileage, my credit card statements. Everything confirms I've stayed within 20 miles of home. The dirt was there anyway. Sometimes late at night I hear something circling my house. Steady footsteps at wrong intervals, tracing the perimeter of my property. I've gone outside twice to check. Found nothing. But in the morning there are prints in the flower bed, cloven, deep, clustered near my bedroom window as if something stood there for hours, watching, shifting its weight, waiting. I've stopped taking pictures. They never show anything anyway. But I've started marking my skin each morning with a felt-tip pen, 3 dots on my left wrist in a triangle formation. Something simple, impossible to forget. Every night before I sleep, I check the marks, confirm they're still there. In the morning, I check again. Yesterday morning there were 4 dots, still in a triangle, but now there's one in the center. I don't remember adding it. Sometimes I wonder if I ever left that forest at all, or if the version of me that came back is the one someone traced onto the tent fabric. A careful outline, a pattern to follow, a shape that holds the memory of being whole but can never be certain it isn't hollow. The old maps still show Goblin Knob in faded pencil. But I've noticed something new. When I trace the topographical lines with my finger, they seem to shift slightly, as if the terrain itself is uncertain, as if the place is waiting to decide what shape it wants to hold next. I haven't thrown away my camping gear. It's still in my truck. Sometimes I think I will go back. Maybe that'll make sense. Maybe I need to see it in daylight, bring someone else, document it properly this time. But then I notice my truck's mileage has increased overnight, and I can't remember the last time I drove anywhere. And I find dirt under my nails again. And somewhere in the house I hear footsteps circling. Story 14. The paper was yellow at the edges, brittle enough that I feared it would crumble when I unfolded it. My grandfather had kept it in a tin box beneath his workbench, wrapped in oilcloth that smelled of dust and something else. Something organic and faintly sweet, like dried flowers left too long in a closed room. The map showed a section of the main border, hand-drawn with the kind of precision that suggested obsession rather than casual interest. Red arrows marked specific trees along what appeared to be an old survey line, each one numbered in his cramped handwriting. There were no other notes, no explanation. Just those arrows and a date from 1967, 3 years before my father was born. My grandfather had refused to speak about his time in Maine. The family learned not to ask. When he passed last autumn, I'd found myself thinking about that silence more than the man himself, wondering what could make someone seal off an entire chapter of their life so completely that even the mention of pine trees would cause him to leave the room. So I went. Perhaps I needed to understand the shape of his fear, or perhaps I simply needed something to fill the hollow space his death had left. Either way, I found myself driving north in early October with the map on my passenger seat, and a growing sense that I was making a mistake I couldn't yet name. The border region was less remote than I'd expected. Small towns dotted the highway, their gas stations and diners displaying the worn friendliness of places accustomed to hunters and hikers passing through. But as I followed the coordinates I'd plotted from the map, the settlements grew sparser, the roads narrower, until I was navigating dirt tracks that probably hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The forest pressed close on both sides. Paper birches stood like pale sentinels among the darker firs, their bark peeling in strips that reminded me of dead skin. I parked where the track became impassable and continued on foot, using a hunting knife to mark my own arrows on tree trunks. Shallow cuts that wept sap like amber tears. The first of my grandfather's marks took me an hour to find. The tree was ancient, a white pine easily 200 years old, and the arrow carved into its bark had healed into a thick scar that pulled the surrounding wood into puckered ridges. I touched it and felt the tree's warmth beneath my fingers, that slow pulse of life that old growth carries. The arrow pointed deeper into the forest, away from any visible trail. I found the second mark within 20 minutes, then the third. Each arrow led to the next with geometric precision, as if my grandfather had been following some invisible line only he could perceive. The forest changed as I progressed. The birches disappeared entirely, replaced by dense stands of spruce so tightly packed that the ground between them lay in permanent twilight. The air grew thick with the smell of resin and damp earth, and I noticed the silence before I consciously registered what was missing. There were no birds, no insects. The forest had fallen into a hush so complete that my own breathing seemed obscenely loud. I made camp at the sixth arrow, building my fire larger than necessary, and keeping my back to a granite outcrop that rose from the forest floor like a broken tooth. The flames crackled and spat, their light pushing back the darkness to a radius of perhaps 15 feet. Beyond that, the trees stood in perfect blackness. The voice came 2 hours after sunset. "Help me." I was adding wood to the fire when I heard it, a man's voice, middle-aged, carrying that particular quality of desperate politeness that comes from not wanting to startle a stranger. It came from the darkness beyond my fire's reach, somewhere to the left of the granite outcrop. "Hello?" I called back, my voice sounding thin and insufficient. "Are you hurt?" Silence. I waited, my hand finding the knife at my belt, my eyes trying to penetrate the wall of black between the trees. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks that died before reaching the branches overhead. "Help me," the voice said again. It was identical. The same tone, the same slight crack on the second word, even the same pause before speaking. Not similar, identical, as if someone had pressed play on a recording. The hair on my arms rose despite the fire's heat. "Where are you?" I tried to keep my voice steady, rational, the voice of someone helping a lost hiker rather than someone fighting the urge to run. "I can't see you." The silence stretched. I fed the fire higher, piling on branches until the flames reached toward the low-hanging spruce boughs, and the light extended perhaps another 5 feet into the darkness. Nothing moved in that expanded circle. No lost hiker stumbled toward the warmth. No eyes reflected the firelight. "Help me." Closer now, maybe 10 feet beyond the light's edge. And again, exactly the same. Same inflection, same pause, same desperate politeness. A recording, I told myself. Someone was playing a recording. But that explanation felt as thin as paper, as insufficient as my voice had sounded moments before. I didn't answer this time. I sat with my back against the granite, the knife in my hand, and waited. The fire burned. The darkness pressed close, and after perhaps 20 minutes, though time had begun to feel unreliable, I heard the breathing. It sounded like an animal in respiratory distress, each inhale a wet, rattling struggle, each exhale a wheezing gasp. Too large for a deer, an elk, maybe, or a moose with pneumonia. The sound moved laterally to my position, staying just beyond the fire's reach, circling slowly from left to right. But beneath the congested breathing, I caught another smell cutting through the clean scent of burning spruce. The thick, cloying odor of soil that had been turned and left to rot, mixed with something sweeter. Spoiled meat, maybe. Or fungal growth on dead wood. Whatever was out there stopped at the very edge of the light. I could sense it there, a presence that displaced air and occupied space but refused to resolve into a visible form. The breathing continued, labored and mechanical, and I realized with a clarity that felt like cold water down my spine that I was hearing something trying to breathe like an animal, something approximating the sound, without understanding the rhythm. I kept the fire high all night. The breathing stayed with me until dawn, that wet, struggling sound punctuated by long silences that were somehow worse than the noise itself. I didn't hear the voice again. but I felt watched with such intensity that my skin crawled and my muscles ached from maintaining constant vigilance. When the first gray light began to filter through the canopy, the breathing stopped mid-inhale. One moment it was there, the next, nothing. Just the returning sounds of the forest waking. A distant crow, the rustle of a red squirrel in the branches above. The normal sounds rushed back in like water filling a hole. I waited until full daylight before leaving the granite outcrop. My fire had burned down to coals, and I scattered them carefully, then turned to find the next arrow that would lead me deeper along my grandfather's marked path. It wasn't where I'd left it. I'd carved my own marks as I traveled. 7 shallow arrows pointing back toward my vehicle, each one positioned to guide me home. They were gone, not worn away or obscured, but deliberately altered. Someone had used a knife to change their direction, transforming my backtrail markers into forward-pointing arrows that formed a corridor leading deeper into the forest. My hands shook as I touched the nearest mark. The cuts were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and damp with sap. They led away from my grandfather's trail, branching off at an angle that pointed toward a thick grove of spruce I hadn't noticed the previous evening. The trees there grew so close their lower branches interlocked, creating a wall of needles that looked almost deliberately cultivated. I should have turned back then. Every rational impulse screamed at me to return to the outcrop, find my own way out, abandon whatever madness had brought me here. But my grandfather's silence held weight, a gravity I couldn't escape. He'd been here. He'd seen something, and he'd spent the rest of his life refusing to speak about it. I followed the altered arrows. The grove was darker than it should have been. The spruce branches formed a canopy so dense that even the morning sun barely penetrated, leaving the forest floor in a twilight that made my eyes strain. The air tasted different here, thicker, heavier, with that same rotting earth smell I'd caught the night before, though now it was strong enough to make me breathe through my mouth. The arrows led to a clearing I almost missed. It was small, maybe 20 feet across, ringed by spruce trees that had been deliberately planted in a perfect circle. Their trunks were scored with marks I didn't recognize, not arrows, but spiral patterns that wound around each tree like the threads of a screw. In the center of the clearing stood a single pine, dead for years, its bark stripped away and its white wood weathered to gray. A silver knife jutted from its trunk at chest height, driven in sideways so the blade was parallel to the ground. The handle was tarnished but elaborate, wrapped in what looked like braided wire. No rust touched the blade despite obvious age. The wood around it showed no rot, no decay, as if the metal had somehow preserved it. I reached for the knife without thinking, my hand extending before my mind could question the impulse. My fingers closed around the handle's cold metal, and I pulled. It didn't budge. I tried again, putting my full weight into it, and the blade moved perhaps a quarter inch before stopping with a resistance that felt less like friction and more like will, as if something was holding it from the other side. The forest went silent again. That same unnatural hush, that absence of life that made my ears ring with phantom sounds. I released the knife and stepped back, suddenly aware that I was standing in the exact center of the clearing, positioned as if I'd been placed there deliberately. The trees around me were wrong. I'd studied them when I entered. 12 spruce in a perfect circle, their trunks evenly spaced. Now there were 13, and I couldn't tell which one was the addition. They all looked identical, all bore the same spiral scars, all leaned inward at the same slight angle. "Help me," the voice said, directly behind me. I spun. Nothing. Just the dead pine with its silver knife, still protruding at that impossible angle. But the voice had come from there, from the tree itself, or from something standing directly behind it where I couldn't see. "Help me." From my left now, then my right, then behind me again, and the same voice, the same recording, coming from multiple directions at once or moving faster than I could track. The spiral-marked trees seemed closer than before, their circle tightening, though I hadn't seen them move. I ran. The altered arrows blurred past me as I crashed through the spruce grove, branches whipping my face and arms. I wasn't following any trail. I simply ran in what felt like the opposite direction from the clearing, From that knife and that voice and those trees that multiplied when I wasn't looking. I should have gotten lost. The forest was dense enough that without marked trails, navigation was impossible. But somehow I found the river, a waterway I hadn't even known was nearby. Its banks lined with smooth stones and its current fast enough to make a constant rushing sound that drowned out the forest's silence. I followed it south. My grandfather's map had shown water somewhere in the region, and water always led somewhere, always provided a route out. I walked for hours, maybe longer, my sense of time as unreliable as my sense of direction. The forest on either side of the river looked normal. Birds called, insects hummed. A deer watched me pass from behind a fallen log. My vehicle was right where I'd left it, though I had no memory of the river passing anywhere near that dirt track. I drove without stopping, my hands cramping on the wheel, my eyes checking the rearview mirror more than the road ahead. I developed the photos 3 weeks later. I'd taken them compulsively during the hike. Documentation, evidence, proof of whatever I'd experienced. Most showed exactly what I remembered. Marked trees, the granite outcrop, the forest in its various stages of wrongness. But the photos from the clearing showed something different. The dead pine was there, weathered and stripped, but there was no knife. The trunk was smooth and unmarked at the exact height where I'd grabbed that silver handle and pulled against resistance that felt like will. I found my grandfather's journal last week, hidden in the same tin box that had held the map. Most entries were mundane: weather observations, geological notes, the careful documentation of a surveyor doing his job. But the final entry, dated 3 days before he'd left Maine forever, consisted of a single sentence in handwriting that had devolved from his usual cramped precision into something shaking and barely legible. I put the knife back, but it's still following me. I haven't been sleeping well. The house settles at night with sounds that could be old wood cooling or could be something else. Footsteps, maybe, or breathing. Yesterday I found mud on my bedroom floor, tracked in from outside, though I clearly remember removing my boots at the door. The prints lead from the window to my bedside, then back to the window, and they're too large to be mine. Sometimes in that space between waking and sleep, I hear a voice. It's polite, patient, maintaining that same desperate courtesy it had in the forest. It never asks for anything specific, never explains what help it needs. It just repeats those 2 words with mechanical precision, the recording playing on a loop, waiting for someone to answer. And the terrible thing, the thing that keeps me awake even when exhaustion demands I sleep, is that I'm starting to recognize the voice. It sounds like my grandfather. It sounds like me. The map is still on my desk. I've tried to throw it away twice, but it keeps appearing back in the tin box, wrapped in oilcloth that smells of earth and something sweet. The arrows are multiplying. New ones appear each time I look, numbered in handwriting that shifts between my grandfather's cramped precision and my own looser script. They're pointing north, always north, forming a trail that leads back toward a border I never should have crossed. Last night, I found myself at my computer, researching property records for that section of Maine. The land where the clearing sits, if it even exists on any official map, belongs to no one. It's marked as disputed territory, a surveying error from the 1800s that created a small pocket of space that technically exists in neither country. A place between places, where boundaries blur and normal rules stop applying. I keep telling myself I won't go back. That whatever my grandfather found in those woods, whatever made him mark those trees and hide that map and live the rest of his life in silence, has nothing to do with me. But the voice is getting louder and clearer, and I can hear it now even during the day, in the sound of wind through branches, in the rush of water from the tap, in the white noise of traffic outside my window. Help me, always the same, always patient, always waiting. And the worst part is that I'm starting to understand what it wants. Not help in any conventional sense, not rescue or relief. It wants company. It wants someone to take their turn standing at the center of that clearing, holding that knife, waiting for the next person to find the map and follow the arrows. My grandfather did his time. Now it's calling for me. The maps keep appearing. The voice keeps repeating. And every night, the mud tracks on my floor lead a little closer to my bed before turning back toward the window. I think I'm going to drive north again soon. Not because I want to, but because I'm starting to suspect I don't have a choice. That the moment I touched that knife, the moment I tried to pull it free, I became part of whatever circuit my grandfather had joined decades ago. A loop that cycles through generations, marking time with spiral scars and silver blades and voices that repeat the same plea forever. Or maybe I'm just losing my mind. Maybe none of it happened the way I remember. Maybe the isolation, the darkness, the fear. Maybe it all conspired to make me see and hear things that weren't there. Maybe the photos are right and my memories are wrong. And the real horror is recognizing that I can't trust my own perceptions anymore. I don't know which possibility frightens me more. The map is calling me back. The voice is getting louder. And somewhere in the Maine borderlands, in a clearing that may or may not exist, a silver knife waits in a dead tree, holding something between worlds, keeping something contained, or releasing it, one visitor at a time. I'll find out soon enough.